There is a city you probably know by name. You might have seen photographs of its stone parliament buildings, its river, its bridge lights reflected in dark water on a winter evening. You might have learned about it in school, or passed through it once on a trip east, or watched news broadcasts originate from its wide ceremonial streets. It looks like a place that was planned, measured, and constructed in the 19th century by surveyors with flat caps and leather notebooks. It looks like a place whose history began when Europeans arrived and decided to build something lasting. That is the version of the story that gets told. That is the version that fits on a plaque bolted to a limestone wall. But underneath that city, and underneath the other cities this story is going to take you to, something else is waiting. Something that does not fit on any plaque. Something that predates the surveys, predates the European names, predates the concept of a capital city entirely. And the deeper you go into the records, the older the journals, the more careful the oral accounts that have been preserved by people whose ancestors walked this land for thousands of years before anyone drew a border around it, the clearer it becomes that the ground beneath Canada's capital cities has been worked before, shaped before, used before. Not in the vague sense that all land has a history, but in the specific, verifiable, sometimes deeply uncomfortable sense that there are passages down there and chambers and arrangements of stone that do not correspond to any natural geological process and that have been found and quietly noted, and in some cases, quietly closed again, and that most official histories do not mention at all. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is not a story about governments hiding the truth in some dramatic, cinematic sense. It is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling than that. It is a story about what happens when evidence does not fit the accepted model of when and how North America was inhabited. It is a story about what institutions do when a geological survey crew encounters something unexpected in a tunnel beneath a capital city, and the something in question does not have an obvious explanation. It is a story about the distance between what gets written into the official record and what gets whispered between researchers decades later. And it is a story about the land itself, about what it holds, about what it has always held, about what the people who lived on it for 10,000 years knew and encoded in their oral traditions and their relationships with specific places that Europeans later paved over and called foundations. You might be listening to this late at night. The room might be dark and quiet, and the world outside might be doing whatever it does when most people have gone to sleep. And you might be in that particular state of mind that comes just before sleep starts to pull at the edges of your attention, where things feel a little more open, a little less defended, where a story like this one can settle in and do what stories have always done. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. I always check the comments, and there is something genuinely striking about seeing someone in Winnipeg at 2 a.m, and someone in Vancouver at midnight, and someone in Halifax just before dawn, all of them listening to the same story about the ground beneath the places they live. Because that is what this is, a story about the ground beneath the places you live. Or if you do not live in Canada, a story about the ground beneath places that have been sitting on top of older places for a very long time, and about what it means when the older places start to show through. Let us begin in Ottawa. Let us begin with the river. The Ottawa River is not a quiet river. It is wide and fast and cold for most of the year, and in spring it runs with a force that early European travellers found alarming, describing the current in their journals as something that did not want to be crossed. The Algonquin people, who have lived along its banks for thousands of years, call it the Kichi-Sibi, the Great River, and they mean that name in a way that goes beyond simple physical description. For them, and for the Anishinaabe communities whose traditional territory encompasses the Ottawa Valley, the river is a presence, a being, a thing with memory and intention, and the land along its banks is not empty space, but a place so layered with human history that the idea of calling it undeveloped, which is how European settlers described it in the early 19th century, is almost bewilderingly inaccurate. When Lieutenant Colonel John By arrived in 1826 to begin construction of the Rideau Canal, he brought with him the assumptions of his era. He was building in wilderness. He was bringing civilization to a blank space. His surveyors walked the riverbanks and mapped what they saw, which was forest and water and rock. and they made notes about the quality of the limestone outcroppings and the depth of the river at various points. And they began the enormous engineering project that would eventually move more earth and stone than anything else built in Canada up to that point. And in doing that, in digging and blasting and redirecting water and cutting through the limestone plateau that underlies what is now downtown Ottawa, they found things. Not everything that was found made it into the official engineering reports. Some things were noted in private correspondence. Some things were described to colleagues in letters that were filed away and largely forgotten until researchers began systematically going through archival collections in the latter half of the 20th century. There is a letter from 1827 held in the Library and Archives Canada collection, written by one of the engineering officers working under By's command. The officer's name was Hargreaves, a lieutenant whose full record is otherwise undistinguished, a man who seems to have spent his career doing his job competently and without incident. In this letter, addressed to a colleague stationed in Quebec City, Hargreaves describes a discovery made during the initial excavation work on the western bank of the river, in the area that would eventually become the lower town of Bytown. The workers, he writes, had broken through what appeared to be a natural limestone layer and found beneath it a passage, not a cave in any ordinary sense, because the walls of this passage were too regular, too deliberately shaped, to be the product of water erosion. He describes the walls as fitted, which is the word he uses, fitted with flat-faced stones that had been worked on at least one surface. He describes the passage as running in a direction that he estimated as roughly southwest, though he admits that the angle of entry and the darkness inside made a precise bearing difficult to determine. He does not say how far the passage continued. He says only that the workers were unwilling to go far inside, and that By's decision was to fill the opening with rubble from the excavation and proceed with the canal work. What Hargreaves is describing, if taken at face value, is a worked passage beneath what would become the capital of Canada, sealed during the construction of a 19th century engineering project because it was inconvenient and inexplicable, and because there was canal work to be done. The letter is not a sensational document. It is matter of fact in the way that letters from working engineers tend to be. Hargreaves does not speculate about who made the passage or when. He notes it, he explains what was done about it, and he moves on to other matters. That matter-of-fact quality is part of what makes the letter interesting. He is not trying to make a case for anything. He is simply reporting what happened the way a competent officer reports to a colleague. The limestone beneath Ottawa is part of a geological formation that extends throughout the Ottawa Street. Lawrence Lowland, a thick sequence of sedimentary rock laid down roughly 450 million years ago when this region was covered by a shallow tropical sea. Over millions of years, water moving through fractures in this limestone has created a network of caves and passages, some of which are well documented and have been explored by spelunkers and geologists. So when people hear about a passage being found during excavation, the first instinct is to reach for the geological explanation: natural karst formation, water erosion through a fracture zone, nothing unusual. And in many cases that explanation is correct. The Ottawa region does have natural cave systems. The difference is that natural karst passages have a characteristic morphology: irregular walls, scalloped surfaces where water has carved the rock over thousands of years, ceilings that vary in height depending on the fracture geometry. What Hargreaves describes is different. He uses the word fitted. He describes flat-faced stones. These are not the words an observant man uses to describe karst formation. These are the words a man uses to describe something that was built. The Algonquin oral traditions for the Ottawa Valley include references to places beneath the ground that were used by people long before living memory. The Anishinaabe scholar Doris Ledoux, writing in the 1980s in a collection of essays on traditional knowledge and landscape, described the concept she translates as the underplaces, locations along the river and its tributaries that her grandmother's generation knew as significant as places where old work had been done, where the earth had been shaped by hands and for purposes that the community remembered only imperfectly. Ledoux is careful about how she presents this material. She is not making archaeological claims. She is documenting the existence of a category in traditional knowledge, a recognition that the landscape had been modified by earlier peoples in ways that extended below the surface, and that this modification was remembered even when the specific meaning of the modifications had been lost. This is a pattern you will encounter again and again as this story develops. The oral traditions know the underplaces are there. They do not always know why. The European records encounter the underplaces and fill them in with rubble. Neither tradition, by itself, tells you what was actually built, or by whom, or when. But together, they point at something. They point at a set of features beneath the capital cities of Canada that has been found repeatedly and documented inconsistently and explained inadequately for nearly 2 centuries. The Rideau Canal construction was not the only occasion when anomalous subsurface features were encountered in the Ottawa area. In 1901, workers laying new water mains in the Lower Town district broke through into what the foreman described in a report to the city engineer as an older channel, a passage lined with stone that ran beneath the street and appeared to have been used for water management of some kind. The report notes that the passage was larger than what would have been needed for simple drainage, and that the stonework was old enough that the foreman's assessment was that it predated any European construction in the area. The city engineer's response, preserved in Ottawa municipal records, was straightforward. The old channel was to be incorporated into the new water main system, where structurally possible, and where not possible it was to be filled. No one was dispatched to study it. No archaeologist was consulted. This was 1901, and the concept of urban archaeology was not yet in widespread practice, and the prevailing assumption was that any stonework found beneath a city that had been built by Europeans in the last century must have been built by Europeans, and therefore needed no special investigation. But here is the problem with that assumption. The passage encountered in 1901 ran beneath a street in the Lower Town district, which is the oldest settled part of what became Ottawa. This area was extensively developed by the mid-19th century, meaning that if the passage was part of European construction, it should have been in the record. There should have been a contract, a builder's account, some documentation of when it was built and for what purpose. There was nothing. The city engineer noted this in his report, somewhat puzzled, and then proceeded with the practical business of incorporating it into the water system, which is presumably what happened to a great deal of evidence of this kind throughout the history of urban development in Canada. The pattern of finding and filling, finding and incorporating, finding and not asking questions, is one of the most consistent features of the documentary record relating to anomalous subsurface features beneath Canada's capital cities. It is not that people were trying to suppress information. It is that the institutional logic of urban development does not create space for the kind of careful investigation that anomalous findings require. When you are laying a water main, you are on a schedule. When you are building a foundation, you have a contractor waiting. When you break through into something unexpected, you have 2 choices: stop everything and call for an investigation, which costs time and money and will likely produce no conclusive answer anyway, or document what you found as best you can and proceed with the work. Most of the time, throughout the history of Canadian capital city development, the second option has been chosen, and so the underplaces get filled in, one by one, and the record that survives is fragmentary and inconsistent, and the cumulative picture that emerges from the fragments is one that the official histories have not yet found a way to incorporate. This is the situation you are in when you start to take this seriously. You are not working with a single dramatic discovery that changes everything. You are working with a pattern of small, inconvenient findings, spread across a century and a half of urban development in multiple cities, each one explained away or filed and forgotten on its own terms, but collectively pointing at something that has not been explained at all. Let us talk about what the geology actually permits, because that matters enormously for understanding what could have been built here and when. The Canadian Shield, that vast expanse of ancient Precambrian rock that underlies most of central and eastern Canada, is one of the oldest exposed rock formations on the surface of the Earth. Parts of it are more than 4 billion years old. It is not the rock beneath Ottawa, which sits on the younger sedimentary limestone of the Ottawa Street, Lawrence Lowland, but it forms the immediate geological context for cities like Edmonton and Winnipeg, and for the vast territories that connect the capitals to each other. The Shield's antiquity matters for this story, because it means that the landscape itself has been essentially stable, in geological terms, for an enormous span of time. The rivers that drain the Shield today have been flowing in essentially the same directions for at least 10,000 years, since the retreat of the last glaciers. The lakes that sit in shield depressions have been there since the glaciers melted. The elevated ridges and rocky outcroppings that define the shield landscape are the same ones that every human population that has ever lived in this region has navigated by. This geological stability is significant because it means that any construction that was done in the pre-contact period, before European arrival, would have been done in a landscape that is recognizable today. The stone would be the same stone. The waterways that were used for transportation would be the same waterways. The high points, used for observation or ceremony, would be the same high points. When oral traditions say that something happened at a specific location, or that a specific feature of the landscape was modified by earlier peoples, that claim can in principle be checked against what exists there now, because the landscape has not changed in the ways that would make the claim simply untrue on physical grounds. What the landscape has changed is everything above the bedrock. The forests are different, the soil profiles have shifted, the riverbanks have been modified by engineering, the high points have been built on, but the bedrock itself, and the features cut into or built upon the bedrock, remain. And what is being found, repeatedly, in the process of building and rebuilding and expanding and modernizing Canada's capital cities, is that the bedrock beneath these cities shows signs of having been worked. Not everywhere, not continuously, but in specific locations, at specific depths, in ways that suggest deliberate human modification that predates the 19th century by an interval that the conventional archaeological timeline has difficulty accommodating. Let us go to Quebec City now, because Quebec City sits on a dramatic piece of geography that makes the subsurface story there both more complex and more clearly documented than the Ottawa case. Quebec City is built on and around Cap Diamant, a promontory of hard rock that juts out where the St. Lawrence River narrows, commanding views up and downstream for significant distances. The French recognized the strategic value of this location and built their fortifications there beginning in the early 17th century, and those fortifications have been added to and rebuilt and expanded and partially demolished and partially preserved over the following 4 centuries, with the result that the ground beneath the historic core of Quebec City is one of the most archaeologically complex urban environments in North America. Generations of construction have encountered earlier construction, and earlier construction has encountered still earlier construction, and in some cases, what lies beneath the earliest documented European work has been a source of quiet puzzlement to archaeologists, since systematic excavation work began in the 19th century. The Huron-Wendat people, whose traditional territory includes the Quebec City area, have oral traditions that describe a period in the distant past when the high rock was shaped and used by people who came before living memory. The language used in these traditions is careful and specific in ways that matter. It does not say that the high rock was the home of spirits or that it was the site of supernatural events. It says that it was worked, that it was modified, that earlier hands shaped parts of it for purposes that are not entirely clear from the traditions themselves, but that seem to relate to the movement of water and the storage of things the community considered important. The word that is often used in Huron-Wendat traditional accounts, as documented by the ethnographer Albert Morens in a 1947 paper for the Transactions of the Royal Society of Canada, translates roughly as the shaped place, a designation that implies deliberate human modification rather than purely natural formation. When French engineers began seriously fortifying Cap Diamant in the late 17th century, they cut deeply into the rock in various places, creating chambers and tunnels that are now part of the documented network of subterranean passages beneath Old Quebec. Some of these passages are open to tourists, others are sealed. And what the engineers found in several locations during this cutting work was evidence that the rock had been cut before. Not everywhere, and not in a way that was impossible to dismiss as natural formation, but in at least 3 documented locations. The French engineers, working in the late 1600s and early 1700s, encountered passages or chambers in the rock that showed tool marks inconsistent with their own working methods and predating their own excavation work. The most detailed account comes from the journal of an engineer named Lauzon, working in 1720 on the expansion of the lower citadel defences. Lauzon notes that his crew broke into what he first took to be a natural cave, but then describes features that made him revise that assessment. He writes about the evenness of the walls in one section, about marks on the stone surface that appeared to have been made with a metal implement of some kind, and about a floor surface that had been smoothed in a way that did not occur naturally in that type of rock. He notes that his supervisor, when informed of the discovery, instructed the crew to continue the excavation and incorporate what had been found into the new fortification network. He does not express strong emotion about this. He records it the way an engineer records a complication and its resolution. What is significant here is the detail about marks made with a metal implement. Pre-contact peoples in North America worked stone using a variety of techniques, including pecking with harder stone tools, grinding, and in later periods in some regions the use of copper implements. Copper, the pure native copper that was extracted from deposits around Lake Superior and traded throughout eastern North America for thousands of years, can produce tool marks on limestone that look somewhat similar to metal tool marks. This is not a trivial point. The Poverty Point culture in what is now Louisiana, the old copper culture in the Great Lakes region, the Hopewell tradition that stretched across the eastern half of the continent, all of these used copper extensively, and some of them in ways that involve sophisticated metallurgical knowledge that was not generally recognized by the archaeology of the early and mid-20th century. If pre-contact populations were using copper tools to work the limestone of Cap Diamant in Quebec City, Lauzon's description of what looked like metal tool marks would make sense, and it would push the construction date of whatever he found back potentially thousands of years. The old copper culture is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is one of the most extraordinary and most underappreciated chapters in the prehistory of North America, and it is directly relevant to the question of what the subsurface features beneath Canada's capital cities might represent and who might have made them. The old copper culture flourished primarily in the Great Lakes region, especially in what is now Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario. From roughly 3000 BCE to perhaps 1000 BCE, though recent research has pushed the earliest dates back further. At its height, it involved the extraction and working of enormous quantities of native copper from deposits on the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale in Lake Superior, copper that was cold-hammered and annealed into an extraordinary range of objects: spear points, knives, fishhooks, awls, ornaments, and tools whose functions are not always immediately obvious. Estimates of the total quantity of copper extracted during this period run to hundreds of thousands of tons, representing a mining operation of staggering scale that was carried out without iron tools, without draft animals, and without any of the technologies that we conventionally associate with large-scale mining. The distribution of old copper culture objects across North America is extraordinary. These objects have been found throughout the Great Lakes region, across the Midwest, in the Ohio Valley, along the Atlantic coast, and in smaller quantities across much of the rest of the continent. They appear in contexts ranging from simple burials to elaborate ceremonial deposits. They appear in places far from the copper source, meaning that there were long-distance trade networks in operation that could move heavy copper objects hundreds or thousands of miles. These networks, their routes, their logistics, and the social structures that maintain them over centuries or millennia are something that archaeology is only beginning to understand in any detail. What is relevant here is that a culture capable of extracting hundreds of thousands of tons of copper, capable of working it into sophisticated forms, and capable of distributing those forms across half a continent, is also a culture capable of substantial construction work. A culture that organized itself to the degree necessary for that kind of extraction and distribution could organize itself to build things in stone. And the limestone of the Ottawa Valley, the hard Precambrian rock of the Shield, the sandstone and shale of the Western capitals, all of these materials were within the reach of a copper-equipped culture that had the organizational capacity to move ore from Lake Superior to the Atlantic coast. This is speculative, and it is important to be clear about that. There is no established archaeological consensus connecting the old copper culture to the subsurface features being described in these records. But there is a chronological overlap, and a geographical overlap, and a technological capacity overlap that makes the connection worth considering, and that makes the dismissal of these features as natural formations less convincing than it might otherwise be. Let us move west. Let us go to Halifax, because the Halifax case has a documentary trail that is different in character from what we have been looking at so far, and different in ways that matter for understanding the breadth of this pattern. Halifax is built on a peninsula that juts into a harbour that has been one of the finest natural anchorages on the Atlantic coast of North America for as long as anyone has been making use of it. The Mi'kmaq people, whose territory encompasses what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and parts of neighbouring provinces, have lived on this peninsula and in this harbour for at least 10,000 years. Since the retreat of the glaciers opened the coastal landscape for habitation, they know this coast in a way that 10 millennia of continuous relationship produces, not as a set of map coordinates, but as a living, breathing entity with specific personalities and histories in specific locations. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition includes accounts of features of the Halifax Harbour Peninsula that were not made by any human hand that the tradition knows of, but that the tradition is also clear were not natural features. These are features that appear in accounts from elders going back as far as the oral historical record extends, described as the work of the old ones, the earlier people, the ones whose names are not known but whose traces remain in the land. Some of these features are surface features, specific arrangements of rock on the high points of the peninsula that look like random boulders from a distance, but on closer inspection show patterns of placement that suggest intentionality. Others are subsurface features, known through tradition as places where the ground has been worked from below, where there are passages and chambers beneath the rock that can be entered at specific locations when those locations have not been buried under European construction. In 1977, during work on a utility corridor beneath a street in what is now the north end of Halifax, workers encountered a section of subsurface material that the project engineer, a man named Douglas Ferris, described in his site notes as an anomalous stone arrangement at a depth inconsistent with any documented construction activity. Ferris was thorough enough to photograph what he found before the work continued, and those photographs passed through several hands over the following decades, before coming to the attention of a researcher named Catherine Bloor, who was conducting archival research on Mi'kmaq landscape traditions in the 1990s. Bloor describes the photographs, which she was permitted to examine but not copy, as showing a configuration of flat-top stones at a depth of approximately 3.5 meters below the current street surface, arranged in a way that appeared to form the floor or base of a chamber-like space, with what looked like a worked wall surface on at least one side. Bloor included a description of this episode in her 1998 paper on Mi'kmaq oral traditions and landscape archaeology, published in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology. She was careful to note that she could not verify the photographs' content independently, that she had not been able to locate them in any archive, and that Ferris had retired and could not be reached. She included the account not as evidence of any particular claim, but as an example of the kind of incidental documentation that exists in fragmentary form for anomalous subsurface features in Canadian urban environments. Her paper did not receive a great deal of attention when it was published. It received somewhat more attention when researchers began systematically looking for exactly this kind of documentation in the early 2000s. In the wake of growing interest in pre-contact North American history, following a series of archaeological discoveries that significantly complicated the conventional picture. The conventional picture of North American prehistory, as taught in most schools and as assumed in most public discourse for most of the 20th century, was something like this. Humans arrived in North America across the Bering Land Bridge roughly 13,000 years ago, spread south through an ice-free corridor between the retreating glaciers, and populated the continent relatively rapidly, beginning as big-game hunters and gradually developing the diverse range of cultures that European contact encountered in the 15th and 16th centuries. This picture, sometimes called the Clovis First model after the distinctive stone projectile points found at sites in New Mexico and elsewhere, was enormously influential for decades. It was not exactly wrong in every particular, but it was drastically simplified, and it has been substantially revised in the past 20 years. The revision began with sites like Monteverde in Chile, where archaeological evidence of human occupation dates to at least 14,500 years ago, before the ice-free corridor through Canada would have been passable, and it continued with Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, where evidence of human presence now dates to at least 24,000 years ago, pushing human arrival in the Americas back into the depths of the last ice age. And it has been reinforced by ancient DNA studies that reveal a picture of multiple waves of migration, complex population interactions, and the existence of populations in the Americas, whose relationship to the Siberian populations usually invoked as ancestors is more complicated than a simple land bridge crossing would produce. The conventional model was not just simplified. It was wrong in ways that have major implications for what was happening in North America during the long period that most histories treat as essentially empty of notable development. Because if people have been in North America for 24,000 years or more, then the 10,000 years of post-glacial habitation that the conventional model acknowledged is only the second half of the story. The first half, set in a landscape that was partly covered by glaciers and partly in the conditions that existed in the unglaciated refugia along the Pacific coast and perhaps in other locations, is a period about which we know very little in detail, but which was clearly characterized by human cultures of considerable sophistication and longevity. And cultures that have been in a place for 24,000 years have had the time to build things, to modify landscapes, to develop traditions of construction that no longer exist in recognizable form, but that may have left traces in the rock beneath the cities that later peoples built on the same high points and river confluences and harbor peninsulas that earlier peoples had recognized as significant. This is not a fringe idea. It is increasingly the direction that serious pre-contact North American archaeology is moving. The question of what was built in North America before the periods that textbooks discuss is a live research question, and the answers coming back from that research are consistently more complex and more interesting than the conventional picture allowed for. Let us go to Victoria, because the Victoria case involves something that was documented more systematically than the Ottawa or Halifax cases, and because it involves oral traditions from First Nations communities on the south coast of Vancouver Island that are extraordinarily specific about the kinds of subsurface features that existed before European settlement. Victoria is built at the southern tip of Vancouver Island, on a harbour that was, and is, one of the most productive marine environments on the Pacific coast of North America. The Lekwungen-speaking peoples, including the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, have lived in this area for thousands of years, and their relationship with the harbour and the peninsula it occupies is not just historical, but deeply embedded in the geography of the place. The reef systems, the tidal patterns, the movement of salmon through the straits, all of these are encoded in the place names and the stories and the practical knowledge that the community has carried through generations. Among the features of the Victoria landscape that appear consistently in Lekwungen oral traditions are references to places beneath the ground where the old people did their work. The specific nature of this work is described differently in different accounts, but the consistent thread is that the subsurface of the high points of the peninsula, the rocky rises that define the topography of what is now downtown Victoria, contains chambers and passages that were made by people and used for purposes that the traditions describe in terms of keeping things and receiving things and knowing where the water goes. That last phrase, knowing where the water goes, appears in multiple independent accounts collected from Lekwungen elders by the ethnographer Margaret Connolly in the 1950s and 1960s, and it suggests that the subsurface features may have been related to water management, to understanding and perhaps controlling the movement of the underground water that flows through the permeable rock beneath the peninsula. Water management is a category of pre-contact construction that archaeology has increasingly recognized as more sophisticated and more widespread than was previously assumed. The clam gardens of the Pacific coast are one example. Stone structures built in the intertidal zone to create optimal conditions for clam cultivation, which have now been identified at hundreds of sites along the BC coast, and which represent centuries or millennia of organized labor. The fish weirs and stone fish traps that were used throughout the salmon-bearing rivers of the interior are another example. And the evidence, fragmentary but consistent, that water movement through the rock beneath certain sites was understood and managed by pre-contact peoples, is a third category that is beginning to receive archaeological attention. In 1962, during excavation for a new commercial building in downtown Victoria, workers encountered a space in the rock approximately 2 meters below the street surface that the site engineer, in his notes to the developer, described as a chamber-like void with worked surfaces on two of its walls. The notes are brief and technical, and the engineer's primary concern is whether the void represents a structural risk to the foundation being placed above it. He concludes that with appropriate infilling it does not. There is no suggestion that an archaeologist should be consulted. The feature is filled, the foundation is placed, and the building is built. Those engineering notes, found in a collection of development records donated to the British Columbia Archives in the late 1980s, represent one of the clearest documented examples of a work subsurface feature in a Canadian capital city being identified and filled in the course of normal development work, with no investigation of its nature or origin. The Songhees Nation has been aware of this record for some time. Elder Florence Charlie, speaking to a community gathering on the subject of cultural landscape features in the Victoria area in 2003, described the 1962 episode as one of several she could identify from within living memory, where subsurface features associated with the old people's work had been encountered during European-style construction and dealt with by filling or demolition rather than investigation. She noted that the community's own knowledge of where these features existed had been largely passed down through oral tradition, and that several of the locations described in that tradition now correspond to areas that were developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, making systematic investigation of those locations impossible without demolition of existing structures. This is the situation that characterizes subsurface feature research throughout Canada's capital cities. The features are known to exist in many cases through both documentary evidence and oral tradition. But the features are beneath cities. They are beneath streets and foundations and utility corridors. Accessing them for investigation would require disrupting the infrastructure of a functioning modern city, and the institutional appetite for that kind of disruption, in service of investigating features whose nature and significance are uncertain, is essentially non-existent. So the investigation, to the extent that it happens at all, happens in the margins, in the archival record of what was found and filled during past development work, in the oral traditions that describe what existed before development began, and in the rare cases where modern non-invasive survey methods, like ground-penetrating radar, have been used in areas where those methods can be applied without disrupting surface infrastructure. Let us talk about Winnipeg, because Winnipeg has a different character from the Atlantic and Pacific coast capitals, and because the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe communities in the Red River area contain some of the most specific and most consistently documented references to subsurface features of any region in Canada. Winnipeg sits at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, one of the most significant geographic confluences in the interior of North America. For the Anishinaabe and the Cree and the Assiniboine peoples, this confluence was not simply a practical location, though its practical advantages were considerable. Easy access to both river systems, abundant fish and game in the surrounding wetlands, a position that made it a natural meeting place for communities traveling the river routes from different directions. It was also a spiritually significant location, a place where different waters met and where the relationship between those waters was understood in terms of a larger understanding of how the world was organized. The Anishinaabe oral traditions for the Winnipeg confluence area include accounts that go back further than European contact, accounts that describe the confluence as a place where earlier peoples had done substantial work in shaping the land. Some of this work was above ground, the patterns of earthworks that existed in the area before the fur trade era, and that were noted by early European explorers as evidence of substantial prior occupation. Some of it was below ground, passages and chambers associated with specific locations near the confluence that traditions describe as having been used for keeping, for ceremony, and for a purpose that is sometimes described in translation as holding the meeting between the waters, which may be a reference to water management structures that regulated the flow between the two river systems. The above-ground earthworks in the Red River area were noted by early European explorers and fur traders, and then largely destroyed by the agricultural development of the 19th century. The below-ground features have been encountered in the course of the city's development over the past century and a half, and the documentary record of those encounters, while fragmentary, is consistent with the pattern we have been tracing through the other capitals. In 1912, workers excavating for a new building near the Forks, the name now given to the confluence area, broke through into a passage in the clay and silt substrate that the construction foreman described in his site notes as too regular to be natural and running in a dissection that did not match the drainage patterns of the surrounding area. This is an interesting description because the geology of the Forks area is not bedrock but deep deposits of lacustrine sediment laid down when the area was part of the vast glacial lake Agassiz that covered much of the central Canadian plains at the end of the last ice age. A passage in this sediment would be a different kind of feature from a passage in the limestone beneath Ottawa or the hard rock beneath Victoria. It would be more susceptible to collapse, harder to construct, and would require either a lining of some kind or exceptionally stable soil conditions to persist over the long periods implied by the idea of pre-contact construction. What the 1,912 notes describe is a passage that appears to have been lined, at least partially, with flat stones that the foreman describes as being arranged in a way that suggested they had been placed there deliberately. This is consistent with the construction techniques known from pre-contact earthworks and mound-building cultures in the region, where stone lining was used in various kinds of underground construction. It is also consistent with the oral tradition accounts, which describe the passages near the confluence as having been maintained and reinforced over generations. The 1,912 passage was filled in, as was standard practice. The building was completed. The record survived in a collection of construction company archives that were donated to the Manitoba Archives in the 1960s. A more systematic encounter occurred in the 1970s, when utility expansion work throughout the older parts of Winnipeg produced a number of anomalous findings that were collectively noted in an internal memorandum from the city's engineering department. This memorandum, which has been cited in several academic papers on pre-contact landscape features in the Winnipeg area, describes a pattern of subsurface irregularities in specific zones of the city that did not match what would be expected from either natural geological processes or documented historical construction. The memo is careful and non-sensational in its language. It describes the irregularities as features of uncertain origin that are being documented for reference and does not propose any interpretation. But the fact that the city's engineering department found it worth producing a memorandum about these features, rather than simply handling each one as an isolated anomaly, suggests that the pattern was striking enough to be noticed by people with professional knowledge of what normal subsurface conditions look like. The 1970s memo was located by researchers at the University of Manitoba in the early 2000s, as part of a broader project on pre-contact landscape features in the Red River region. Those researchers also worked with Anishinaabe community members to compare the locations described in the memo with locations identified in oral tradition as places where below-ground features existed. The overlap was not perfect, and the researchers were careful to note that it could not be taken as proof of any direct correspondence. But it was substantial enough to be described in their published work, and it added another layer to the cumulative picture being assembled from disparate sources across multiple capitals. This is what the evidence actually looks like, and it is important to sit with that and understand what it means. It does not look like a single dramatic discovery. It does not look like a sealed chamber full of artifacts that rewrites history in a single afternoon. It looks like a pattern spread across a century and a half, across multiple cities, documented in the records of utility workers and construction foremen and city engineers and ethnographers and community elders, none of whom, individually, was making a case for anything. Each one was simply recording what they found, or what they knew, in the context of whatever work they were doing. And the pattern those records make, when you lay them out side by side and look at them with the question of what they collectively suggest, is a pattern that implies substantial pre-contact construction activity beneath the sites of multiple Canadian capital cities, activity that the conventional archaeological timeline has not yet incorporated, and that the conventional urban development process has been systematically filling in for generations. Let us go to Fredericton, which is the smallest of Canada's provincial capitals in terms of population and perhaps the least discussed in terms of its pre-contact history, but which has an extraordinarily rich documentary record of subsurface anomalies, due in part to the unusually thorough work of a single researcher who spent the better part of 3 decades assembling that record. The researcher was a retired geologist named Wallace Briscoe, who had spent his career with the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources and who turned, in his retirement in the 1980s and 1990s, to a systematic examination of the archival record of subsurface findings in the St. John River Valley, where Fredericton sits. Briscoe was not an archaeologist. He had no theoretical stake in any particular interpretation of what he found. He was a geologist who was used to looking at the subsurface record and who applied the same systematic approach to the archival record that he had applied to the rock record throughout his career. What he produced over the course of his retirement was a document he called Anomalous Subsurface Conditions in the St. John River Valley Urban Corridor, which he completed in 1999 and which he self-published in a limited edition that was distributed to provincial libraries, the University of New Brunswick, and a small number of colleagues and interested parties. Briscoe's document is extraordinary for its thoroughness. He went through the records of every significant construction and utility project in the Fredericton area going back to the mid-19th century, looking for any mention of unexpected or unexplained subsurface conditions. He found 47 documented instances spread across 140 years of workers or engineers encountering conditions that they described in terms suggesting something other than natural geology or documented historical construction. He categorized these by type: passages, chambers, worked stone arrangements, anomalous drainage features, and what he called shaped voids, which is a term he used for features that seem to have been deliberately excavated into the natural substrate without matching any known construction purpose. His conclusions were cautious. He explicitly stated that he was not arguing for any specific interpretation of what these features represented. He was noting that they existed, that they formed a pattern in time and space, and that the pattern suggested systematic pre-contact modification of the subsurface environment in the St. John River Valley. He called for a systematic archaeological survey of the area and for the development of protocols to ensure that future construction work in the region included provision for archaeological assessment of anomalous subsurface findings. Neither of those things happened, at least not in any organized or comprehensive way. Briscoe's document has been cited in a handful of academic papers, mostly in the context of the broader discussion of pre-contact landscape modification in the maritime provinces. It has not received the attention it deserves, partly because it was self-published and therefore not part of the peer-reviewed literature, and partly because its subject matter sits at the intersection of several different disciplines: geology, archaeology, oral history, urban planning, none of which has a clear mandate to deal with it as a whole. The Wolastoqiyik people, also known as the Maliseet, have been the primary indigenous presence in the St. John River Valley for as long as the oral historical record extends, and probably much longer. Their relationship with the river, which they call the Wolastoq, meaning the good river or the shining river, is one of the defining features of their cultural identity. Their oral traditions include extensive knowledge of the landscape of the valley, knowledge that encompasses both the surface features, the fishing spots, the travel routes, the gathering places, and the subsurface features, the places where the ground has been worked, where passages and chambers and constructed drainage features exist beneath the soil. The Wolastoqiyik elder, Mary Paul, speaking to a community gathering on landscape and cultural memory in 1995, described the concept that underlies this knowledge in terms that are worth dwelling on. She said that for her people, the land was not a passive surface to be used, but an active presence to be in relationship with, and that part of that relationship involved knowing the land in depth as well as in extent, knowing what was beneath the surface as well as what was on it. She said that the people who came before the people she had learnt from had worked the land in depth, had shaped it below the ground in ways that served purposes she did not always know, but that the tradition recognized as real and important. And she said that some of those workings were still there, still intact, still part of the land structure, though they were in many cases buried under European construction. Mary Paul was not speaking as an archaeological authority. She was speaking as a keeper of a tradition, and the distinction matters. What she was describing is not evidence in the archaeological sense, but it is testimony, and it is testimony that corresponds closely to what Briscoe found in the archival record, and the correspondence is not something that can be easily explained away as coincidence. The oral tradition knows the subsurface features are there. The archival record confirms, in the most fragmentary and incidental way imaginable, that features of the kind described in the oral tradition have been encountered during construction work. Neither source, on its own, can tell you what those features are, or who built them or when. Together, they point at something that the standard history of Fredericton and the St. John River Valley has not yet found a way to accommodate. Let us turn to something that has become one of the most provocative threads in this entire investigation. The question of what the chambers and passages that have been documented beneath Canadian capital cities might actually have been for. Because the fact of the features, if you accept that the evidence supports their existence, which is itself a significant step, tells you very little about their purpose. And without some idea of purpose, the features remain disconnected from any larger narrative of pre-contact North American history. There are several frameworks for thinking about this, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is the most practical, that these are infrastructure features, drainage systems, water management structures, storage facilities, built by organized communities with practical needs that required subsurface construction. This framework has the advantage of connecting the features to well-documented construction traditions from pre-contact North America. The mound-building cultures of the eastern continent built elaborate earthwork complexes that incorporated drainage and water management features as a matter of course. The Chaco Canyon Great House tradition in the American Southwest involved extensive subsurface construction, including kivas, which were partially or fully subterranean ceremonial and functional spaces. The Hohokam canals in what is now Arizona represent an even more dramatic example of organized subsurface water management by pre-contact populations. There is no theoretical reason why populations in what is now Canada could not have engaged in similar construction traditions, and there is growing evidence that some of them did. The second framework is ceremonial, that the chambers and passages represent spaces for ritual activity that was intentionally conducted below ground. This framework also has extensive support from pre-contact North American cultures. The Mississippian tradition that reached its height at Cahokia in what is now Illinois between roughly 900 and 1300 CE involved elaborate underground chambers associated with specific ritual practices. The earthworks at the Newark site in Ohio, the largest geometric earthwork complex in the ancient world, incorporated features that appear to have been used for ceremonies related to lunar cycles. The Serpent Mound in Ontario, Rice Lake Serpent Mound, and other Ontario earthworks represent the northernmost expressions of traditions that extended throughout the eastern half of the continent. Subsurface ceremonial spaces would be consistent with these traditions, and several of the oral tradition accounts that describe the features beneath Canadian capital cities use language suggesting ceremonial or ritual use. The third framework is the one that is most difficult to evaluate, but perhaps most interesting, that the features represent elements of a systematic practice of knowledge, storage, and transmission, that the chambers and passages were used to preserve information, objects, or practices that needed to be kept safe across generations or across catastrophic disruptions. This framework draws on the concept of what archaeologists sometimes call the repository function, the practice, documented in several pre-contact North American traditions, of creating secure underground spaces specifically intended to protect things of cultural or practical importance from the kinds of disasters, floods, fires, warfare, social disruption that have always threatened the continuity of human knowledge. The oldest, clearly documented examples of this practice in North America come from the Archaic period, the broad cultural epoch that followed the end of the last ice age and preceded the emergence of the mound-building traditions, and they suggest that the practice of creating secure underground repositories has a long history in the continent. These three frameworks, infrastructure, ceremony, and repository, are not mutually exclusive, and it is likely that many of the features described in the historical and oral tradition record served multiple purposes simultaneously. The same underground space could function as a water management feature, a ceremonial gathering place, and a repository for important objects or knowledge. This kind of multifunctionality is common in pre-contact North American construction traditions, where the practical and the ceremonial are not separate categories in the way that modern Western categories tend to organize them. The oral tradition accounts from the various communities whose traditional territories encompass the capital city sites, consistently use language that suggests exactly this kind of multifunctionality. The Anishinaabe concept of the underplaces that Doris Ledoux described in connection with the Ottawa Valley is not limited to a single purpose. It encompasses features that were used for water, for keeping, and for what she translates as the work of the old ones, which in context seems to refer to ceremony, or perhaps to a form of knowledge transmission. The Wolastoqiyik accounts Mary Paul described in connection with the Fredericton area use similar language, shaped places below the surface that served practical and ceremonial purposes simultaneously. The Lekwungen traditions for the Victoria area described the subsurface features as places of knowing and keeping, a phrase that suggests both information storage and ceremonial function. The Huron-Wendat traditions for Quebec City describe the shaped place in terms of water, storage, and ceremony, explicitly listing all three functions. This consistency across geographically and culturally distinct communities is striking and suggests that what we are looking at is not a set of isolated local practices, but a broader tradition of subsurface construction that was shared, in some form, across a large portion of pre-contact North America. A tradition that the conventional archaeological timeline has not adequately documented, partly because the features themselves are hard to access and study, partly because they have been systematically disrupted by urban development, and partly because the conventional framework for thinking about pre-contact North American populations has underestimated both their numbers and their organizational sophistication. Let us go now to Edmonton, because Edmonton sits on the North Saskatchewan River, and because the North Saskatchewan River Corridor is one of the most significant travel routes in the interior of North America, a route that has been in continuous use for thousands of years, and that connected the Great Plains to the north and the mountain passes that lead to the Pacific coast. If any major subsurface features were built in the western interior of Canada, Edmonton's location, at the meeting of the river route and the plains, would make it a likely site. The Cree and Nakota peoples, who have used the North Saskatchewan corridor for generations, have oral traditions that describe the river valley and the high banks above it, in terms that include references to work done below the ground by earlier peoples. The Cree word that is used in connection with these features translates roughly as the shaped ground, a term that encompasses both surface and subsurface modification, and that is distinct from terms used for natural features of the landscape. The shaped ground is something that was made in the Cree conceptual framework, not something that occurred on its own. The high banks of the North Saskatchewan at Edmonton are composed primarily of thick deposits of glacial till and post-glacial sediment, which is different from the bedrock that the Ottawa and Quebec City features are embedded in. This geological difference matters because it means that subsurface construction in the Edmonton area would have been done in a softer substrate, one that is more amenable to excavation by hand, but also more susceptible to collapse, water infiltration, and the kind of long-term degradation that makes preservation over millennia more difficult. If there were substantial subsurface features in the Edmonton Valley banks, they would not necessarily be expected to have survived intact. But the oral tradition accounts don't claim intact features. They claim traces, signs, the remnants of shaped places that have been altered by time and by river erosion and by the glacial till substrate's tendency to shift and settle. The 1980s were a period of significant infrastructure work in Edmonton, as the city expanded rapidly during the energy economy boom, and several of the pipeline and utility projects from that period produce site notes that have been examined by researchers interested in pre-contact landscape features. A study conducted by researchers at the University of Alberta in the mid-2000s, looking at these archival construction records, identified 14 instances from the 1970s and 1980s of workers reporting subsurface conditions in the River Valley area that were described as unusual, not natural in the normal sense, or in one memorable phrase, too tidy to be just mud. That last phrase came from the field notes of a pipeline inspector in 1979, who was noting that a clay layer encountered at a particular depth showed characteristics, a level surface, a consistent thickness, signs of having been compacted or worked, that suggested it had been modified by human activity. The inspector filed the note as part of his standard site documentation and moved on. He was not making a claim about pre-contact construction. He was noting an anomaly in the way that a careful professional notes anomalies that don't fit expected patterns. 14 instances of this kind of anomaly found in archival records from a single decade of construction work in one part of one city is not a negligible number. Each one individually is ambiguous, explicable by any number of mundane causes, but the pattern they form when looked at together, combined with the oral tradition knowledge of shaped places in the same general area, suggests that the Edmonton River Valley has the same character as the other capital city sites we have been examining. The underplaces are there, in some form. The record of them is fragmentary and incidental, and the gap between what the record contains and what a serious investigation might reveal is significant. Let us talk about what a serious investigation would actually look like, because the absence of such an investigation is itself one of the most significant features of this story. Ground-penetrating radar technology has advanced dramatically over the past 2 decades. It can now detect subsurface features at depths, and with a precision that was not possible when most of the archival records we have been discussing were created. In the right geological conditions, GPR can identify voids, work stone arrangements, compacted surfaces, and other indicators of subsurface construction with sufficient clarity to justify targeted investigation. The technology has been used to great effect at several pre-contact sites in North America, revealing previously unknown features at sites like the Newark Earthworks in Ohio and at Cahokia in Illinois. It has also been used, to a limited extent, in urban environments, where the presence of subsurface utilities and the disturbances of past construction limit its effectiveness but do not eliminate it entirely. A systematic GPR survey of the locations identified in the archival record as the sites of anomalous subsurface findings, combined with the locations identified in oral tradition accounts as places where the shaped ground is known to exist, would be the most rational starting point for a serious investigation of the pattern we have been tracing. Such a survey would not be cheap. In the urban environment of a functioning capital city, the logistical and bureaucratic challenges alone would be substantial. But the technology exists, the need is clear, and the potential significance of what might be found is high enough to justify the effort. The fact that no such systematic survey has been conducted across any of the capital city sites discussed in this story is a reflection of several overlapping institutional failures. Archaeological research in Canada is funded and organized primarily through provincial and territorial heritage agencies, which have limited budgets and which prioritize sites that are already in the process of being disturbed by development work. The federal government's involvement in archaeological research is similarly limited and similarly tied to the development context. The universities that conduct most pre-contact North American archaeological research operate with the budget constraints that all academic research faces, and the kind of multi-city, multi-year, interdisciplinary project that this investigation would require is difficult to fund through conventional academic channels. Indigenous communities, who have the most direct stake in the investigation and who hold the oral tradition knowledge that is essential for interpreting any findings, have limited capacity to drive this kind of research independently and have historical reasons to be cautious about entering into collaborative research arrangements with institutions that have not always treated their knowledge or their heritage with respect. The result is that the investigation has not happened in any organized or comprehensive way, and the evidence continues to accumulate in the margins, in the archival records of construction work, in the oral tradition accounts documented by ethnographers and community members, and in the occasional academic paper that tries to pull the threads together and note the pattern. This is a situation that could change. The increasing recognition in Canadian archaeology and heritage management of the significance of Indigenous oral tradition as a form of evidence, a recognition that has been driven partly by the specific requirements of duty to consult obligations, and partly by the general shift in the field's understanding of what constitutes valid evidence, creates an institutional context in which the kind of collaborative research that this investigation requires is more possible than it has ever been. The growing technical capability for non-invasive subsurface survey creates a methodological pathway that did not exist in the 20th century, and the growing public interest in pre-contact North American history, driven by a series of major archaeological discoveries over the past 2 decades that have consistently pushed back the timeline and increased the assessed sophistication of pre-contact populations, creates a cultural context in which a serious investigation of anomalous subsurface features beneath Canada's capitals would receive attention rather than being ignored. The question is whether the institutional will to undertake that investigation will emerge before the remaining accessible evidence disappears under the next generation of urban development. Because the pattern we are documenting is a pattern in flux. Every year, construction work in the capital cities destroys or buries evidence that was previously accessible. Every year, elders who carry oral tradition knowledge of the shaped places pass away, and the specific, detailed, locally precise knowledge they carry is lost if it has not been recorded. The window for investigation is not open indefinitely. Let us go to Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan, because Regina has a quality that none of the other capital cities in this story shares. It sits on land, that is, in a geological sense, almost entirely made of Cree and Nakota and Assiniboine territory that was among the last in Canada to be converted to agricultural settlement, and which therefore has an archival record of the landscape at a later stage in the process of transformation from Indigenous use to European settlement. That later stage record is more detailed in some ways than what is available for the Atlantic and Pacific coast capitals, because the people who documented the conversion of the prairies were writing in an era of more systematic record-keeping, and because the communities who had lived on the prairies for generations were in some cases still present and able to describe what the landscape had contained before the transformation. The plains around what became Regina were not empty when European settlement arrived. They were a landscape that had been inhabited, managed, and modified by human populations for thousands of years. The earthwork features of the plains, the medicine wheels, the stone alignments, the circular and linear arrangements that dot the landscape from Manitoba to Alberta are some of the most visible evidence of this long history of human presence, and they have been the subject of growing archaeological attention over the past several decades. What is less visible and less studied is the subsurface component of this history. The Cree and Nakota oral traditions for the Regina area include accounts of places where the ground was shaped below the surface by the old ones. These accounts are consistent in their location. They cluster near the creek systems and the wetland areas that defined the most productive parts of the plains landscape, and they describe features that served multiple purposes, including water management, storage, and what is described as knowing the direction of things, a phrase that in context seems to refer to some kind of orientation or astronomical function. The medicine wheels of the plains, which are surface features, are known to have astronomical orientations, with their spokes pointing towards significant solar and stellar positions. The oral tradition accounts of subsurface features describe similar astronomical orientation, which is interesting because it suggests that whatever tradition produced the medicine wheels may also have produced subsurface features with related functions. The documentation of these subsurface features in the Regina area is sparse compared to the capital cities that have been built up for longer, because Regina itself is a relatively young city, having been established only in 1882 as a tent city on the plains. The earliest construction records that might contain evidence of anomalous subsurface findings are from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period when systematic record-keeping was variable, and many of the early construction records have not survived. But what has survived is suggestive. A report from the city's first sewer construction project, conducted in the late 1880s, includes a notation by the project engineer about an unexpected finding at a particular depth that he describes as a prepared clay surface, smooth and level, at a point where natural deposition would have produced irregular and unstratified material. He notes this as a curiosity and attributes it tentatively to some natural process of clay consolidation, though he acknowledges that the degree of smoothness and levelness is unusual. This is the kind of notation that Briscoe found throughout the Fredericton record, careful, professional, attributing the anomaly to natural processes when no other explanation is immediately available, but noting the specific characteristics that make the natural explanation uncomfortable. A later episode, from the 1950s, when the city was building its underground water and sewer infrastructure, produced a more striking account. A construction foreman named Keith Alden, in a report to the city engineer that is preserved in the Regina Municipal Archives, describes breaking into what he calls a depression or chamber in the clay at a depth of approximately 2.5 meters, with what he describes as deliberate surface preparation on the walls and bottom. He notes that the chamber appeared to contain some kind of organic material, possibly charcoal or carbonized plant material, and that there was an entrance feature, a narrowing of the opening on one side, that appeared to have been deliberately shaped. He recommended that the chamber be examined by someone with relevant expertise before it was filled, but the city engineer's response, also preserved, directed him to complete the infilling as quickly as possible to avoid delays to the project schedule. Alden added a final note expressing his opinion that the feature warranted investigation. Then it was filled. The Alden report is one of the clearest documented instances of exactly the institutional dynamic that has characterized the treatment of anomalous subsurface findings throughout Canada's capital cities. A professional with direct observational access to a potentially significant feature recommends investigation. The institutional response, driven by schedule and budget, directs filling without investigation. The recommendation and the response are both preserved in the record. The feature is gone. The question it raised remains unanswered. Let us go to Charlottetown on Prince Edward Island, because the island itself has a quality that makes its pre-contact history particularly interesting, and because the Mi'kmaq traditions for the island include some of the most specific accounts of subsurface features in any capital city territory in Canada. Prince Edward Island is a sandstone island, which gives it a geological character entirely different from the limestone and shield rock of most of the other capital territories. The red sandstone that defines the island's landscape and gives it its characteristic colour is a soft, workable stone that erodes quickly at the coast and that has produced a landscape of low hills, red-cliffed shores, and a network of rivers and inlets that made it one of the most productive environments in Atlantic Canada for marine resources. The Mi'kmaq have lived on the island, which they call epekwik, meaning lying in the water or something resting on the waves, for thousands of years, and their relationship with it is recorded in oral traditions of great depth and specificity. The subsurface features described in Mi'kmaq oral traditions for epekwik are different in character from what we have encountered at the other capital sites, partly because of the sandstone geology. What the traditions describe is not passages cut into rock, but chambers formed in and between sandstone formations, with worked surfaces and what sounds like engineered drainage, using the natural layering of the sandstone to create spaces that could be made stable through appropriate shaping. This is a construction technique that would be very difficult to identify archaeologically because the sandstone erodes and the chambers formed within it would in most cases have collapsed or filled over the thousands of years since they were made. What might survive is not the chambers themselves, but the evidence of modification in the surviving rock, marks and shaped surfaces that distinguish worked from natural sandstone in ways that can be identified by careful examination. During the construction of the water and sewer infrastructure in Charlottetown in the early 20th century, workers in the older parts of the city encountered red sandstone formations at various depths, which was expected given the island's geology. What was not expected, in several instances, was finding sandstone formations that showed what appeared to be tool marks or worked surfaces at depths below any documented historical construction. A 1924 report from the city engineer to the Charlottetown Water Commission mentions encountering stone formations at 2 locations that showed markings inconsistent with natural weathering and inconsistent with any European construction activity, and recommends that the Commission consider whether further investigation is warranted. The Commission's response, if any, is not preserved. The features were presumably incorporated into the infrastructure work and are now somewhere beneath the streets of Charlottetown, either intact in the form of marked sandstone visible to anyone who could access the utility tunnels, or long since disrupted by subsequent work. The Mi'kmaq traditions for the Charlottetown area are collected in the work of Father Pacifique, a Franciscan missionary who spent decades in the maritime provinces in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who recorded extensive oral tradition material from Mi'kmaq elders, material that is now available in French translation at the archives of the Franciscan Order in Quebec and in English summaries in several academic papers. Pacifique's methodology was not perfect by modern standards, and he introduced his own interpretive frameworks in places, but the underlying material he recorded is considered broadly reliable by researchers familiar with the tradition. Among the material he recorded for Prince Edward Island specifically are several accounts of what he translates as the arranged rock, places in the island's landscape where rock had been worked into forms that served purposes the tradition associates with keeping, learning, and what Pacifique somewhat awkwardly translates as the teaching of the place. This last concept seems to refer to a kind of learning that was associated with specific locations, a form of place-based knowledge transmission in which the physical features of a site, including its subsurface features, were part of the teaching medium. This concept of place-based knowledge transmission is one of the most interesting threads in the broader investigation of pre-contact subsurface features, because it suggests that some of the underplaces may have been designed not just to contain things, but to teach things, to serve as physical frameworks for knowledge that needed to be experienced in a specific location to be fully understood. The concept parallels, in interesting ways, the function of certain kinds of memorial landscapes in other pre-contact traditions, where specific physical environments were structured to encode and transmit knowledge through the experience of moving through and within them. It also parallels, at least structurally, the function of certain kinds of ceremonial spaces in traditions from elsewhere in the world, where underground chambers served as the setting for initiatory experiences designed to impart specific forms of knowledge. Whether this conceptual framework accurately describes the purposes of the subsurface features beneath Canada's capital cities is impossible to determine from the available evidence. But the fact that the framework appears in multiple, independent oral tradition accounts from different cultural groups across the country is significant. It suggests that if the features were built by people who shared or were in contact with each other's traditions, they may have shared an understanding of what underground constructed spaces were, for that was more unified and more sophisticated than a simple inventory of practical purposes would suggest. Let us talk about St. John's, Newfoundland. Because Newfoundland is in some ways the end of one story and the beginning of another in the history of pre-contact North America, and because the features documented in the St. John's area have a character that connects the underplace's story to the much larger question of what was happening in the North Atlantic before European contact. St. John's is the oldest European settlement in North America, if the Norse visits to Lance or Meadows around 1000 CE are excluded, which they often are in popular history, though they should not be. The harbour at St. John's has been used by European fishermen since at least the late 15th century, and there is a historical argument, contested but serious, that it was known to European fishermen as early as the 1480s. But the Beothuk people, the indigenous inhabitants of Newfoundland, had been using the island for at least 2,000 years before the earliest possible European contact, and the maritime archaic people who preceded them had been in the Newfoundland region for considerably longer, with dates for maritime archaic occupation going back at least 7,000 years in the archaeological record. The Beothuk oral tradition is not available to us in the way that Mi'kmaq or Anishinaabe or Cree traditions are available, because the Beothuk people were exterminated. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanordithit, died in 1829, and the knowledge transmission that oral tradition depends on was disrupted by the destruction of the community before anything like systematic documentation could be accomplished. What we have is fragmentary. Some material recorded by William Epes Cormack, who travelled across Newfoundland in 1822 and made contact with the last few Beothuk communities, and some material recorded from Shanordithit herself in the years before her death. These accounts describe features of the Newfoundland landscape in ways that suggest extensive knowledge of the island's geography, including its subsurface. But the documentation is too fragmentary, and the mediation too heavy to draw reliable conclusions. What can be said is that the features associated with maritime archaic occupation of Newfoundland, some of which are the oldest and most complex pre-contact features in the Atlantic region, include ceremonial and functional elements that required sophisticated organization and extended over long periods. The maritime archaic burial complex at Red Bay and the cemetery features at Port au Choix represent organized use of underground space for ceremonial purposes that is consistent with the broader pattern of pre-contact subsurface feature construction across the continent. These features are not beneath St. John's specifically, because St. John's sits on a peninsula that was not the primary locus of maritime archaic occupation. But they establish that the tradition of deliberate subsurface construction in the Newfoundland region is ancient and well established. The area around St. John's itself, Harbour Grace, Carbonear, the Avalon Peninsula, shows evidence of pre-contact occupation extending back several thousand years, and the specific geological character of the Avalon, which is underlain by some of the oldest rock on Earth, Precambrian formations that predate even the Canadian Shield in their exposure, creates conditions where subsurface features built even thousands of years ago could in principle survive. During construction work in St. John's in the early 20th century, when the city was expanding rapidly after the First World War, several instances of anomalous subsurface findings were noted in the records of various construction projects. These records are now in the Newfoundland and Labrador archives, and they have been examined by researchers working on pre-contact landscape features in the maritime region. The most striking of these records comes from 1923, during the construction of a new section of Duckworth Street, one of the city's oldest streets running along the north shore of the harbour. Workers encountered a feature at a depth of approximately 4 meters below the street surface that the construction foreman described as a worked cavity in the rock, with flat surfaces on 3 sides and what appeared to be a sealed entrance on the 4th side. The foreman was explicit that the sealing material on the entrance appeared to have been placed deliberately, as the stones forming the seal were arranged in a way that created a reasonably tight closure against the surrounding rock. The feature was opened, found to contain no visible contents, and then incorporated into the drainage system being installed as part of the street reconstruction work. That last detail, the deliberate sealing, is one of the most consistently interesting features of the accounts that have been documented across the various capital city sites. Multiple accounts from multiple cities in multiple time periods describe encountering features that appeared to have been intentionally closed or sealed. In the Ottawa case, Hargreaves described a passage that showed clear signs of having been used, but not of being a simple ongoing access route. In the Quebec City case, Lauzon's account of the fortification work includes a reference to a section of passage that appeared to have been blocked at one end. In the Halifax case, Ferris's photographs, as described by Bloor, showed what she interpreted as a sealed, or at least deliberately closed chamber entrance, and in the St. John's case, the 1923 foreman's report describes a sealed entrance in terms specific enough to distinguish it from simple rockfall or natural blockage. The pattern of intentional sealing is significant because it suggests a deliberate act of closure that implies the features were sealed at a specific time, for a specific reason, by people who expected that the closure would be permanent, or at least would persist for a significant period. This is consistent with the concept of the repository function described earlier, the creation of secure underground spaces for the long-term protection of important objects or knowledge. It is also consistent with the oral tradition accounts that describe the underplaces as having been closed, in some cases as part of a deliberate decision by the people who used them to end or interrupt that use. The Anishinaabe traditions that Doris Ledoux documented for the Ottawa Valley include accounts of underplaces that were deliberately sealed by the old ones as part of a decision to move or to change their relationship with the place. The closing was not described as abandonment, but as a form of preservation, a way of keeping what was in the places safe until it was time for them to be opened again. Similar accounts appear in the Wolastoqiyik traditions for the St. John River Valley and in the Micmac traditions for Nova Scotia, in both cases using language that describes the sealing of underplaces as a considered act rather than a simple cessation of use. This is a different understanding of sealed underground spaces from the Western archaeological concept of a site that was abandoned and then covered by natural deposition. It is closer to a concept of intentional archiving, of creating a closed and protected space with the expectation that its contents or significance would be recognized by future peoples who found it. Whether that understanding is accurate, whether the sealed features beneath Canada's capital cities are the product of deliberate archiving by populations who expected them to be found and understood at some future time, is impossible to say with certainty, but it is a framework that the oral tradition evidence consistently supports, and it is a framework that changes the significance of the finding and filling pattern that characterizes the historical treatment of these features. If the features were sealed with the expectation of being found, then filling them in without investigation is not just a missed archaeological opportunity, it is the failure of a communication that someone worked very hard to make possible. Let us go deeper into the question of who might have built these features, because the answer to that question, or even the partial answer that the available evidence supports, is important for understanding the significance of what we have been examining. The conventional archaeological timeline for pre-contact North America, even in its revised and updated form, does not have a good account of organized construction activity in the northern part of the continent during the period between the end of the Ice Age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, and the emergence of the mound-building traditions in the eastern woodlands, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. This 8,000-year gap is not a gap in human occupation. Humans were clearly present throughout the continent during this period. It is a gap in the recognized record of organized construction activity. During this period, the archaeological record shows tool use, food processing, mortuary practices, and some evidence of long-distance material exchange. But it does not show, in the mainstream account, the kind of large-scale, organized construction that would be consistent with the scale of features implied by the cumulative record of anomalous findings we have been examining. There are several reasons why this might be. The most obvious is preservation bias. Features built in organic materials like wood or basket weave cordage do not survive for 8,000 years. And even stone features in many environmental conditions do not survive intact for that long without additional protection. If the features beneath the capital cities were built during this period, the fact that they are in many cases below the water table or in protective geological contexts, in limestone voids or sandstone depressions or clay-lined chambers, is exactly what would be required to explain their survival. Another reason is excavation bias. The archaeological record of pre-contact North America has been assembled primarily from surface and near-surface sites, from cave sites with exceptional preservation, and from sites that happen to have been in locations where systematic investigation occurred. The subsurface of modern urban environments, which is where the features we have been discussing are located, is precisely the kind of context that conventional archaeological investigation does not reach, for the practical reasons we have already discussed. The absence of this kind of feature from the standard archaeological literature is thus not surprising, given the absence of methodologies that would detect it. A third reason, one that is increasingly discussed in the literature on pre-contact North American archaeology, is that the organizational complexity of populations in this period has been systematically underestimated. The assumption that small band hunter-gatherer populations of the early post-glacial period were not capable of organized construction on the scale implied by the features in question rests on a picture of those populations that is increasingly being revised. The evidence for long-distance material exchange during the early and middle Archaic periods, the evidence for organized hunting strategies that required coordination across large areas, and the evidence from ancient DNA studies for population movements and interactions that imply complex social organization all suggest that the populations of the early post-glacial period were more sophisticated and more organized than the conventional picture has allowed for. The Archaic period in North America, which spans roughly the period from 10,000 years ago to the emergence of the mound-building traditions, is one of the longest and most poorly understood periods in the continent's human history. It is the period during which the descendants of the earliest Americans developed the diverse range of adaptations and social forms that would eventually give rise to the complex cultures of the woodland and plains traditions. It is also, in the revised archaeological understanding that has emerged over the past 2 decades, a period of considerably greater complexity and organization than was previously recognized. Studying the Archaic in North America is like studying the Neolithic in Europe before the invention of European prehistory as a discipline. You are looking at a period of enormous importance and considerable sophistication that has been under-researched and under-theorized because it does not fit the dominant narrative of what prehistory looked like. The features beneath the capital cities, if they are as old as the oral tradition accounts suggest, and if the oral traditions are preserving information about construction that predates the mound-building period, would be Archaic period features. They would represent the built environment of populations that the archaeology of the 20th century categorized as simple foragers, people without architecture, without organized communities, without the capacity for the kind of sustained collective effort that large-scale construction requires. The evidence, both from the archival record and from the oral traditions, suggests that categorization was wrong. Let us think about how these various threads connect to each other, because one of the most important questions about the pattern we have been tracing is whether it represents a single unified tradition of subsurface construction or a set of independent local practices that happen to share certain characteristics. The geographic distribution of the capital city sites we have been examining is relevant here. Ottawa, Quebec City, Halifax, Fredericton, St. John's, Charlottetown, Winnipeg, Regina, Edmonton, Victoria. These cities sit in different geographical regions, have different underlying geologies, and are associated with the traditional territories of different Indigenous peoples who speak different languages and have different cultural traditions. If the subsurface features in all of these locations share enough common characteristics to constitute a unified tradition, that would imply the existence of a pre-contact cultural network spanning the entire breadth of what is now Canada, a network sophisticated enough to maintain consistent construction practices across enormous distances. The evidence does not allow a definitive conclusion on this question. The features themselves are too poorly documented, and in most cases no longer accessible for direct study, to permit a detailed comparison of construction techniques and design principles. What can be said is that the oral tradition accounts from different communities do share certain common themes: deliberate subsurface modification, multifunctional use, intentional sealing, and the concept of the underplaces as significant and remembered elements of the cultural landscape. These shared themes could reflect a genuinely unified tradition, or they could reflect independent responses to similar practical and ceremonial needs by different communities, or they could reflect the transfer of traditions through the long-distance exchange networks that clearly existed in pre-contact North America. The long-distance exchange networks are important to keep in mind here, because they establish that different Indigenous communities in different parts of the continent were in regular contact with each other and were exchanging not just material objects, but presumably also practices, ideas, and knowledge. The spread of old copper culture objects from the Great Lakes throughout eastern North America, the spread of Hopewell ceremonial practices from Ohio throughout the woodlands, the spread of Mississippian iconography from Cahokia across a vast geographic range. All of these demonstrate that pre-contact North America was not a collection of isolated local cultures, but an interconnected world in which ideas and practices moved along the same routes that objects moved. If one community in this network developed a tradition of subsurface construction, the tradition could have spread to other communities through exactly the same mechanisms that spread copper objects or ceremonial practices. The oral traditions for several of the capital city sites explicitly describe the underplaces as features inherited from or learned from communities that were connected to the local community by trade or kinship relations. The Anishinaabe accounts for the Ottawa Valley describe the underplaces as the work of ancestors who came from different directions, suggesting construction by populations that moved through or settled in the area from elsewhere. The Huron-Wendat accounts for Quebec City describe the shaped place as something that was there before the ancestors arrived, suggesting a feature built by a still earlier population. The Mi'kmaq accounts for Nova Scotia describe the underplaces in some cases as the work of older peoples who were encountered by the Mi'kmaq ancestors and whose traditions were partially incorporated into Mi'kmaq practice. These accounts are consistent with a picture of multiple waves of population movement and cultural transmission in pre-contact North America, which is precisely what the ancient DNA evidence now supports. The picture that is emerging from genetic studies of pre-contact North American populations is one of complex movements, mixings, and replacements over many thousands of years, with the populations encountered by European colonists being the latest in a long series of cultural configurations rather than the original inhabitants of a static landscape. In this context, the underplaces beneath the capital cities might represent the construction traditions of populations that preceded or were contemporary with the ancestors of the communities whose oral traditions describe them, traditions that were partially remembered and partially lost as population compositions changed over the millennia. This is a complex picture, and it resists the kind of simple narrative that popular history tends to prefer. It is not a story about a single mysterious civilization that built all the underplaces and then vanished. It is a story about a long and complex history of human activity in the landscape that is now Canada, a history in which organized subsurface construction was part of what different peoples did in different ways for different purposes over a very long time, and in which that history has been systematically invisible because it was underground, because the institutions responsible for urban development did not ask the right questions when they encountered it, and because the oral traditions that preserved knowledge of it were not taken seriously enough for long enough to prevent their content from being dismissed or ignored. Taking that history seriously now, in the early 21st century, when both the technical tools to investigate it and the institutional frameworks to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into that investigation are more developed than they have ever been, is one of the most significant opportunities in the archaeology of North America. The underplaces are still there, at least in many locations, sealed beneath the streets and foundations of cities that were built without asking what was already there. They are waiting, as they have been waiting for a very long time, for someone to ask the question seriously enough to actually look. There is something I want you to hold in mind as this story develops, something that is easy to lose in the details of archival records and oral tradition accounts and geological descriptions. What we have been building a picture of, piece by piece, is not just a set of physical features. It is a relationship between human communities and the land they inhabited, a relationship of extraordinary depth and intimacy, a relationship in which the land was not just a surface to be lived on, but a structure to be participated in, shaped by in return, worked and learned from, and in some cases, literally inhabited, not just above the ground, but below it. The peoples who built the underplaces, whoever they were, did not experience the ground beneath their feet as inert material. They experienced it as an environment, as a space with properties and possibilities that rewarded careful attention and skilled engagement. They learned the way water moved through rock and clay. They learned which substrates could bear the stress of enclosed spaces and which could not. They learned how to shape stone and soil into forms that served their needs while maintaining the stability that would allow those forms to persist. They accumulated this knowledge over generations and transmitted it through exactly the mechanisms, oral tradition, practical apprenticeship, and the deliberate design of teaching environments that the archival and oral tradition records we have been examining describe. This relationship with the deep ground was not unique to any single cultural tradition. It appears, in various forms, throughout the human story. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum in Malta, which dates to roughly 3600 BCE, is one of the most spectacular expressions of the human impulse to work beneath the ground, a multi-story underground complex carved from Maltese limestone that served ceremonial purposes over a period of more than 1,000 years. The underground chambers of Cappadocia in Turkey, which were constructed by multiple civilizations over many centuries, demonstrate the same impulse in a completely different geological and cultural context. The kivas of the ancestral Puebloan tradition in the American Southwest, partially subterranean ceremonial spaces that have been in continuous use for 1,000 years, represent a living tradition of constructed underground ceremonial space in North America itself, and the underplaces of Canada's capital cities, as described in the archival record and the oral traditions, are part of this same broad human tradition of engaging with the ground not just as a surface, but as a medium, as a space to be entered and shaped and used. Recognizing that tradition in the context of pre-contact North America means revising the picture of what North American pre-contact cultures were capable of and interested in doing. It means taking seriously the evidence that organized, deliberate, sophisticated construction was happening in the northern part of the continent during periods that the conventional timeline has treated as essentially construction-free. And it means engaging with the oral traditions that have preserved knowledge of this construction not as colorful background material but as sources of evidence that, when read carefully and in context, tell us things about the pre-contact landscape that no amount of archival research can fully substitute for. The road to taking this seriously runs through a kind of institutional humility that has not always been easy for the disciplines involved to achieve. Archaeology, as a discipline, has historically had a complicated relationship with Indigenous knowledge, sometimes dismissing it entirely, sometimes selectively incorporating it in ways that served existing theoretical frameworks without genuinely engaging with the knowledge on its own terms. The relationship is improving significantly and in some cases remarkably, but the improvement is uneven, and the institutional structures that would support genuinely collaborative investigation of features like the underplaces are still being developed. What is clear is that the potential rewards of this investigation are enormous. Not in the sensational sense of discovering a lost civilization that rewrites human history in a single dramatic revelation, but in the more important and more lasting sense of recovering a more accurate understanding of what was happening in North America during the 10,000 years that the conventional account treats as essentially uneventful. The underplaces are evidence of an event, or rather of an ongoing series of events, of organized human activity, construction, use, and careful closure that has been systematically overlooked. Recovering that evidence, and recovering the oral tradition knowledge that can help interpret it, is the work of a generation, at least. But it is work that is now, in the early 21st century, more possible than it has ever been. Let us circle back to Ottawa one more time, because there is a thread in the Ottawa story that we touched on but did not follow far enough, a thread that connects the specific case of the Rideau Canal excavations to a much broader question about what the Ottawa Valley represented in the pre-contact world. The Ottawa River is one of the longest rivers in eastern Canada, and its watershed encompasses an area of approximately 146,000 square kilometres, draining parts of what are now Ontario and Quebec, and connecting the Great Lakes drainage system to the St. Lawrence through a complex of rivers and lakes. For canoe-travelling peoples, which is to say for virtually every human community that has ever lived in this part of North America, the Ottawa River system was a superhighway, a network of connected waterways that allowed movement across the entire region with a minimum of portaging and a maximum of speed and carrying capacity. The fur trade era recognized this immediately, and the Ottawa River became one of the primary arteries of the fur trade economy within decades of European contact. But it had been a primary artery long before the fur trade. It had been a primary artery for as long as there were people to use it, which is to say for at least 10,000 years, and perhaps considerably longer. A primary artery in a travelling network is also a primary location for the kinds of features that support travel and trade. Resting places, supply caches, places where goods can be exchanged and knowledge can be transmitted. The confluence of rivers, where different travel routes meet, and the narrows and rapids where travellers are forced to portage, are the natural nodes in this network, the places where activity concentrates and where permanent or semi-permanent features are most likely to be built. The site where Ottawa now stands is exactly one of these nodes. It sits at the confluence of the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, adjacent to the Chaudière Falls, one of the most significant rapids on the Ottawa River, which forced portage and therefore concentrated travellers at that point for as long as travel was happening on the river. The concentration of travellers at the Chaudière portage over thousands of years would be expected to produce exactly the kind of subsurface feature accumulation that the archival record for Ottawa describes. If people were stopping at this location regularly, over generations or millennia, and if those people had a tradition of subsurface construction for storage, ceremony, or knowledge transmission, the limestone bedrock beneath the Ottawa waterfront would be the obvious place to build those features. The features would be close to water, which is practical for all three purposes. They would be in a location where travellers could find them, if the location of the features was part of the knowledge transmitted through the exchange network. And they would be in a location that was known and recognized as significant across a wide range of communities, making it a natural site for features with a regional or continental significance. This is speculation, and it deserves to be labelled as such. But it is speculation grounded in the geography and the logic of the pre-contact travel network, and it is consistent with the documentary and oral tradition evidence in a way that makes it at least a plausible framework for thinking about why Ottawa, and not some less geographically significant location, has produced the specific archival record that it has. The Chaudière Falls themselves have a significance in Algonquin oral tradition that goes far beyond their practical role as a portage site. They are described as a place of power, a place where something essential about the world is visible, where the relationship between the water and the rock teaches something that the tradition encodes in stories and ceremonies associated specifically with the falls. The Anishinaabe historian Claudette Commander, writing in the 1990s about the significance of the Chaudière in Algonquin tradition, describes the falls as a place where the Old Ones did their most important work, where the knowledge that needed to be in a specific place was placed there, in the rock below the water's reach. The knowledge that needed to be in a specific place. This phrase, as Commander uses it, refers to a concept in Anishinaabe tradition of location-specific knowledge, understanding that is inseparable from a particular place and cannot be fully transmitted except in that place. The underplaces at the Chaudière, as described in Anishinaabe tradition, are the physical containers for this location-specific knowledge, the places where that knowledge resides and from which it can, in principle, be recovered. This concept of location-specific knowledge is one of the most philosophically interesting dimensions of the underplaces story, and it is one that connects it to a much broader tradition of thinking about the relationship between place and knowledge that appears in Indigenous traditions around the world. The Australian Aboriginal tradition of the songlines, the network of roots across the continent along which specific knowledge is encoded in stories, songs, and physical features of the landscape, is perhaps the best-known example of this kind of thinking. The concept that knowledge is not just information that can be extracted from its context and carried anywhere, but is intrinsically related to specific places and can only be fully accessed in those places, is a concept that appears in Indigenous traditions from every continent, and that represents a fundamentally different epistemology from the Western tradition of abstract, portable, written knowledge. The underplaces, as repositories of location-specific knowledge, make sense within this epistemological tradition in a way that they do not fully make sense within the Western tradition of thinking about knowledge. Within the Western tradition, putting knowledge underground does not make it more accessible, it makes it less accessible. Why would anyone build elaborate underground chambers to store knowledge that could simply be written down and kept anywhere? But within the Indigenous tradition of location-specific knowledge, putting knowledge in a specific place is exactly how you preserve it, because the knowledge is inseparable from the place, and the place is the preservation medium. The chamber is not a container for abstract information. The chamber, the rock around it, the water near it, the sky above it, the stories associated with it, are all parts of a single knowledge system that can only be accessed in its entirety in the specific location where it was built. This understanding of the underplaces does not require you to accept any particular metaphysical claim about the nature of knowledge or the nature of place. It requires only that you take seriously the possibility that the people who built these features had a different and internally consistent understanding of what they were doing, an understanding that makes sense of the features in a way that the purely practical interpretations of infrastructure, storage, and ceremony do not fully capture. Let us spend some time on the question of scale, because the scale of what the aggregate evidence suggests is one of the most difficult things to hold in mind while working through these individual cases. When you lay out all the archival records we have discussed, the engineering reports, the construction notes, the city engineer memos, the field notes of the various professionals who encountered anomalous subsurface features during development work across Canada's capital cities, the cumulative picture is of a very large number of features spread across a very large geographic area, encountered across a span of more than 150 years of urban development. The Briscoe document for Fredericton alone identified 47 instances in a single river valley over 140 years. If comparable densities of encounter occurred in the other capital cities, and the available evidence suggests they did, the total number of documented encounters across all of the capitals would be in the hundreds, each one individually ambiguous, together forming a pattern of a scale that implies construction activity of considerable magnitude. What is the actual scale of the underplaces? This is a question that cannot be answered from the available evidence, because the evidence is too fragmentary and the features themselves are too inaccessible. But some inferences can be drawn. The oral tradition accounts consistently describe the underplaces not as individual chambers or passages, but as networks, connected systems of features that extended through specific areas and that had specific entry points and specific internal organizations. The Anishinaabe accounts for the Ottawa Valley describe a network of underplaces extending along both banks of the Ottawa River for a considerable distance above and below the Chaudière Falls. The Wolastoqic accounts for the Fredericton area describe a network along both banks of the Wolastoq, extending for several kilometers in each direction from the city centre. The Cree and Nakoda accounts for the Winnipeg confluence area describe features extending along both the Red and Assiniboine rivers for distances that suggest a network covering a substantial portion of what is now the city. If these descriptions are even approximately accurate, and the archival records provide some independent corroboration that the features exist in the general areas described, then the underplaces are not isolated curiosities, but elements of intentionally designed systems, spread across the river, landscapes that form the cores of these capital cities. The scale of construction that would have been required to build these systems, if the oral tradition descriptions of their extent are even roughly correct, is substantial. It would have required organized labor, applied over significant periods of time, by populations with the knowledge and tools to work the relevant substrates and with the social organization to coordinate and sustain the work. This brings us back to the organizational capacity question that we have been circling throughout this story. The conventional picture of pre-contact populations in northern North America does not easily accommodate the organizational capacity implied by the scale of construction suggested by the evidence. But the conventional picture is changing, driven by exactly the kind of cumulative evidence from ancient DNA, from revised archaeological dating, from the systematic study of oral traditions as evidence that we have been discussing. The change is not yet complete. The conventional picture has not been revised to the point where the underplaces of the capital cities fit comfortably within it. But the direction of change is clear, and it is toward a picture of pre-contact North American populations that is substantially more organized, more sophisticated, and more capable of large-scale construction than the 20th century account recognized. There is another dimension of the scale question that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most practically significant. If the underplaces exist at the scale that the oral tradition accounts suggest, and if some portion of them have survived the disruption of urban development in accessible or potentially accessible forms, then they represent an archaeological resource of extraordinary significance, not just for the academic question of what was happening in pre-contact North America, but for the living communities whose ancestors built these features and whose oral traditions have preserved knowledge of them. The underplaces, as described in those oral traditions, are not historical curiosities. They are cultural heritage, in the fullest and most consequential sense of that term, places where knowledge was deliberately stored, where ceremonies were conducted, where the relationship between specific communities and specific landscapes was encoded in physical form. Recovering that heritage, or even recovering knowledge of its existence and location, has significance for those communities that goes far beyond the academic. This is one of the reasons why the collaborative model of investigation, bringing together Indigenous knowledge holders, archaeologists, geologists, and urban planners in a structured research framework, is not just ethically preferable to conventional top-down archaeological investigation, but practically superior. The oral tradition knowledge that is necessary for meaningful investigation of these features is held by Indigenous communities. Without access to that knowledge, archaeological investigation of the underplaces would be operating with one hand behind its back, able to find and describe features, but unable to interpret them in the context of the traditions that gave them meaning. With access to that knowledge, investigation becomes enormously more powerful. The tradition tells you where to look, what to look for, and how to understand what you find, in ways that purely material analysis cannot replicate. The institutional frameworks for this kind of collaborative research are developing. Several universities in Canada have established programs specifically designed to integrate Indigenous knowledge with scientific research methodologies. Several provincial heritage agencies have developed protocols for including Indigenous knowledge holders in the assessment of archaeological findings. Several specific research projects have demonstrated the value of this kind of collaboration for understanding pre-contact landscapes. The underplaces research represents exactly the kind of problem that these frameworks were developed to address. And there is reason to hope that as these frameworks mature, and as the evidence for the underplaces continues to accumulate, the conditions for a serious and systematic collaborative investigation will develop. That investigation will take time. It will require sustained funding, sustained institutional commitment, and sustained trust between researchers and Indigenous communities. It will produce results that are complex and sometimes difficult to fit into existing narratives about either pre-contact history or modern heritage management. It will require the kind of patient, methodical work that does not produce dramatic announcements, but that gradually builds a more accurate and more complete picture of what was here before the cities were built. But the picture that will emerge, if the investigation is conducted with the rigor and the openness that the evidence requires, will be worth the effort. Because what the evidence points toward is a pre-contact North America of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, a world in which organized communities built substantial features in the landscape and the sub-landscape across enormous geographic ranges, in which knowledge was transmitted through networks of both trade and tradition that connected communities thousands of miles apart, and in which the ground itself was understood as a medium for human activity and human memory in ways that the settlers who built Canada's capital cities did not recognize, and that mainstream history has not yet fully incorporated. The underplaces are waiting beneath the streets of Ottawa and Quebec City, beneath the harbour of Halifax and the red cliff shores of Charlottetown, beneath the river confluence at Winnipeg and the plains at Regina, beneath the valley banks at Edmonton and the harbour peninsula at Victoria, beneath the ancient rock of St. John's and the river valley at Fredericton. They have been waiting for a long time. They have been encountered and filled in and noted and forgotten and rediscovered and noted again across 150 years of urban development, in the records of construction foremen and city engineers and colonial administrators and visiting ethnographers, in the oral traditions of the communities whose ancestors built them, in the self-published documents of retired geologists and the footnotes of academic papers that received insufficient attention when they were published. They are part of the land beneath Canada. They are part of the story of what happened here over thousands of years before the story that most histories of Canada begin with, and they deserve to be understood. There is a particular quality to the kind of evidence we have been working with in this investigation, and it is worth pausing to reflect on that quality because it is different from the kind of evidence that most historical narratives depend on, and the difference matters for how we should think about what the evidence tells us. Most historical evidence is what you might call intentional. It was created with the explicit purpose of recording or communicating something. A letter is intentional. A diary is intentional. An official report is intentional. The person creating these things was thinking about what they wanted to say and saying it. The evidence we have been examining is, for the most part, different. The engineering notes from the 1920s Charlottetown construction work were not written with any intention of recording evidence of pre-contact subsurface features. The engineer was writing about drainage requirements and substrate conditions. The fact that his description of the substrate conditions implies the existence of worked sandstone surfaces is, from his perspective, a side effect of describing what he encountered rather than the purpose of the description. The same is true for Hargreaves's letter from the 1827 Ottawa Canal work, for Keith Alden's 1950s Regina report, for the 1912 Winnipeg construction notes. These are not documents produced by people trying to make a case about pre-contact history. They are documents produced by people doing their jobs, and the evidence they contain about pre-contact subsurface features is incidental to their primary purpose. This incidental quality is actually one of the most important characteristics of this evidence. Intentional evidence, evidence created with a specific purpose in mind, is always susceptible to the critique that it was shaped by the creator's intentions, that it is evidence of what the creator wanted to be true, as much as it is evidence of what was actually there. Incidental evidence, evidence that contains implications the creator did not intend and may not have recognized, is harder to dismiss on those grounds. The construction foreman, who noted that a clay layer was too tidy to be just mud, was not trying to establish anything about pre-contact history. He was noting a substrate condition that complicated his work. His note is evidence precisely because he had no investment in its implications. The oral tradition evidence has a different character from either intentional or incidental written evidence, and it is important to understand what that character is. Oral traditions are not simply descriptions of events. They are living systems of knowledge transmission, structured to preserve specific information across generations through mechanisms like narrative structure, ceremonial context, and the requirement of transmission through a recognized authority. The information they preserve is shaped by those mechanisms in ways that differ from how written documents shape information, and those differences affect how the evidence should be interpreted. But oral traditions are not therefore less reliable than written evidence. They are differently reliable, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities, and the methodology for working with them as evidence is different from the methodology for working with written documents. What the oral tradition evidence for the underplaces consistently demonstrates, across multiple communities in multiple regions, is the existence of a recognized category in the indigenous knowledge of this land, a category of significant subsurface features that were made by human hands, that have specific locations, and that are associated with specific cultural meanings and functions. The oral traditions do not always agree on the details of what was made, by whom, or when. They do agree that something was made, that it was made deliberately, and that it matters. That agreement, across culturally distinct communities, with independent oral tradition systems, is the most important thing the oral tradition evidence tells us. Combined with the incidental written evidence, the pattern of anomalous subsurface findings documented in the archival records of more than a century of urban construction, this agreement between independent evidence sources forms an evidentiary basis that is stronger than either source alone, and that is, in the considered opinion of the researchers who have engaged most seriously with this material, sufficient to justify the kind of systematic investigation that has not yet occurred. The investigation has not occurred, and understanding why it has not occurred is part of understanding the story. It has not occurred because of the institutional dynamics we have discussed. The budget constraints of urban archaeology, the scheduling pressures of construction projects, the absence of protocols requiring investigation of anomalous subsurface findings before they are filled in, and the broader failure of the academic and heritage management institutions to treat the evidence that exists as requiring a response. But there is another factor that deserves acknowledgement, and it is a factor that is less comfortable to discuss. The evidence for the underplaces challenges a narrative that has been very important to the institutional history of Canada, the narrative that what is now Canada was essentially empty of significant cultural complexity before European settlement, that the peoples who lived here were present but not building, not organizing, not constructing the kind of permanent features that would leave a mark on the landscape, and that the project of establishing Canada as a nation was therefore not a displacement of an existing cultural order, but a development of an essentially empty land. This narrative has served specific political and economic purposes throughout the history of Canada, and it continues to shape how Canadian history is taught and understood in ways that are significant for ongoing questions of Indigenous rights, land claims, and the meaning of reconciliation. Evidence for substantial pre-contact subsurface construction beneath the sites of Canada's capital cities does not fit this narrative. It suggests, instead, that the sites of those capital cities were chosen, whether consciously or not, partly because they were already significant locations in the pre-contact landscape, already marked by human presence and human construction, already nodes in networks of movement and exchange that had been active for thousands of years before European settlement. It suggests that what the settlers built on was not empty ground but layered ground, ground whose layers they did not recognize or chose not to recognize, and that the history of those capital cities begins not in the 19th century, but in a much more distant past. This is not a comfortable suggestion for institutions that have a stake in the conventional narrative, but it is the suggestion that the evidence supports, and the evidence deserves to be taken seriously on those terms rather than dismissed because it points in an inconvenient direction. Let us talk about what the future of this investigation might look like, and about what the people who care about this question, whether as researchers, as community members whose heritage is at stake, or as citizens who think the history of their country should be accurate, can do to move it forward. The first and most important step is documentation. The oral tradition accounts that describe the underplaces are being lost as the elders who carry them pass away. Systematic documentation of these accounts, conducted in partnership with the communities that hold them, with appropriate protocols for managing sensitive information and ensuring community control over how the knowledge is used, is the most urgent priority. This documentation does not require large budgets or elaborate institutional structures. It requires time, relationships, and the kind of respectful listening that genuine partnership demands. The second step is archival research. The pattern of incidental documentation in construction records, engineering reports, and institutional archives that we have traced in this investigation is almost certainly more extensive than what has been located so far. Systematic examination of the relevant archival collections, looking specifically for the kind of incidental evidence we have been discussing, would significantly expand the evidentiary base and would provide the geographic and temporal specificity needed to plan targeted investigation. The third step is non-invasive survey. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and other non-invasive survey technologies can be applied in many urban environments without disrupting surface infrastructure and can identify subsurface features that warrant further investigation before any decision about accessing them is made. A phased program of non-invasive survey, beginning in the locations most clearly identified by both the oral tradition and the archival evidence as likely sites of underplaces, would be a rational and relatively cost-effective way to establish whether the features described in those sources are present in the form suggested. The fourth step is the development of protocols for what happens when anomalous subsurface features are encountered during construction work. The current situation, in which the standard response to an anomalous finding is to fill it in and proceed, is the primary mechanism by which evidence is being destroyed before it can be examined. Protocols that require a brief stop-work period when specific types of anomalous features are encountered, combined with rapid response access to relevant expertise, could significantly reduce the rate at which evidence is lost. These protocols exist in some jurisdictions, particularly in areas with strong Indigenous heritage protection legislation, but they are inconsistently applied and rarely specifically designed to address the kind of subsurface features we have been discussing. These four steps are not heroic. They are not the stuff of dramatic discovery. They are the unglamorous, methodical, institutional work that genuine historical investigation actually consists of. And they are work that the evidence available today clearly warrants. The underplaces of Canada's capital cities deserve to be investigated, and the investigation is possible. There is a way of looking at this story that is not about discovery, or investigation, or institutional failure. There is a way of looking at it that is about what it means to live in a place, about what it means to know the ground beneath your feet and to understand what it holds. The people who built the underplaces, whoever they were, knew the ground beneath their feet in a way that most modern city dwellers do not and cannot. They knew it as an environment, as a medium for activity, as a space that could be entered and shaped and made useful and meaningful. They went into the earth not as a desperate act, but as a considered one, in full knowledge of what the earth was and what it could offer, and they made things there that they believed would last, that they sealed with the expectation that the closure would hold. In some cases, it has held, through 10,000 years or more of geological change and climatic shift and the disruption of urban development. Some of the underplaces are still there, still closed, still holding whatever was placed in them. In other cases, they have been found and filled in, their contents lost and their significance ignored. In still other cases, they have simply been lost, washed away by river erosion or collapsed by the settling of the substrate, or simply beyond the reach of any evidence we currently have access to. But the tradition that produced them, the understanding of the ground as an environment, the practice of working below the surface for purposes that combine the practical and the ceremonial and the epistemic in ways that Western categories have difficulty separating, that tradition has not been lost. It survives in the oral accounts of the communities whose ancestors lived it. It survives in the landscape knowledge of elders who know the underplaces are there without having been inside them. It survives in the question that this story raises, and that no amount of archival research or non-invasive survey can fully answer. What did the people who went into the earth know that we have forgotten? That question is worth sitting with, not because there is a simple answer, or any answer that can be given in words, rather than in the experience of actually going to the places and attending to what they have to tell. But because the question itself is important, it points at a dimension of human engagement with the earth that has been systematically undervalued in the dominant culture of modern cities, a dimension that the peoples who built the underplaces considered central rather than marginal, essential rather than optional. The night sky above Ottawa and Quebec City and Halifax and all the other capitals is the same sky that the people who built the underplaces watched. The rivers flowing through those cities are the same rivers, in their general courses, if not in all their details, that those people navigated and portaged and camped beside. The rock beneath the streets is the same rock they worked. The continuity is not just genetic or cultural, it is physical, material, embedded in the geography of the continent itself. And the underplaces are part of that continuity. They are the physical record of a relationship between people and the land beneath them that extended over thousands of years and that has not, despite everything, been entirely erased. Recognizing that record, taking it seriously as evidence of what was here before the cities, is not just an act of historical accuracy, though it is that. It is an act of recognition, of acknowledging that the ground we live on has a history that extends beyond what the official histories say, that it was shaped by people who had sophisticated knowledge and complex purposes, and that their work is still there, beneath our feet, waiting for the serious attention it deserves. The window of opportunity for this investigation is not permanent. Every year, development work in the capital cities disrupts and destroys features that might otherwise have been accessible. Every year, elders who carry oral tradition knowledge of the underplaces pass away, and the specific, precise, locally grounded knowledge they carry is lost if it has not been recorded. Every year, the archival records from the early period of urban development in Canada get more fragmented as documents are lost to time and inadequate archival practice. The urgency is real, even if it does not have the character of a dramatic deadline. And there is one more thing to say about the underplaces, something that is harder to categorize than the archival evidence, or the oral tradition accounts, or the geological analysis. It is something about what it feels like to know they are there. There is a particular quality of attention that comes when you know that the ground beneath you has been worked by human hands. When you know that someone, at some time, went into the earth here and made something, for purposes they considered important enough to build into the landscape, with care and skill and the intention of permanence. When you walk the streets of Ottawa, knowing that beneath the limestone somewhere there is a passage that a 19th century engineer described with the word fitted, knowing that the Anishinaabe oral tradition describes this confluence as a place where the old ones did their most important work, knowing that the Chaudière Falls have been a place of power for thousands of years, in a tradition that predates any record we have of them, that knowledge changes the quality of your attention to the place. It does not make the streets, or the buildings, or the ordinary life of the city feel less real. It makes them feel more layered, more historical, more alive with the presence of all the human activity that has happened there across the full span of time. This is what good history does. It does not diminish the present by making the past seem more important. It enriches the present by revealing the depth of the world that the present inhabits. The underplaces are part of that depth. They are layers of the world beneath the cities that were built on top of them, layers that have been building for thousands of years before the first European surveyor arrived with a flat cap and a leather notebook and decided that he was building in empty wilderness. He was not building in empty wilderness. He was building in a landscape that had been inhabited and shaped and worked and made meaningful by human beings for a very long time. And some of what those human beings made is still there, beneath his canal and beneath the streets that followed it, patient in the dark, holding the shape of whatever it was that the old ones put there when they went into the earth. That patience is worth dwelling on when you think about it. Something and, in some way, that is hard to articulate but easy to feel, moving. The underplaces have outlasted the peoples who built them, in many cases. They have outlasted the specific purposes for which they were built, or at least the living knowledge of those purposes. They have survived the disruption of glacial rebound and river erosion and a century and a half of urban development. They have survived everything except systematic investigation, which has not yet come, and they wait. In the Algonquin tradition, as documented by Commander and others, there is a concept of the land as a keeper, a living entity that holds things in trust across time. The underplaces, in this understanding, are not just features in the rock, but expressions of the land's role as keeper, places where the land was worked in partnership with human communities to create the conditions for long-term holding. When those human communities dispersed or changed, or were disrupted by contact with European settlement, The land continued its role as keeper, holding what had been placed in trust, waiting for the conditions that would make the kept things available again. Whether you hold that understanding literally or metaphorically or somewhere in between, it offers a way of thinking about the underplaces that does not reduce them to either archaeological curiosities or sensational mysteries. They are places where knowledge was deliberately kept. The keeping has been going on for a very long time. The conditions for that knowledge to be accessible again are developing, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. And the people who care about what the kept knowledge contains, the descendants of the communities who placed it there, and the researchers and citizens and curious listeners who have followed this story to its current unresolved state, are part of the conditions that will eventually make that knowledge accessible again. This is not a story that ends with a definitive discovery or a final explanation. It ends, as it began, with a question, and with the recognition that the question matters, that the answer is somewhere beneath the streets of Canada's capital cities, and that the work of finding it is work worth doing. The river still flows beneath the bridge lights of Ottawa. The harbour still catches the light at Halifax. The red cliffs of Charlottetown still drop to the sea. The plains still roll out from Regina in every direction. The valley still holds the city of Edmonton in its river-carved curve. And beneath all of them, beneath the streets and the foundations and the utility corridors and the sealed urban infrastructure of a modern country, something waits. Something that was made by people who knew the ground beneath their feet in a way that we have only begun to try to understand. Something that has outlasted everything except our willingness to ask what it is. We are asking. That is the beginning. There is a story that surfaces in the records of the Geological Survey of Canada, buried in the correspondence files of the late 19th century, that is worth spending some time on because it illustrates the broader pattern from a slightly different angle. In 1889, a GSC survey team working in the Quebec City region was conducting a systematic examination of the limestone formations underlying the Cap Diamant promontory as part of a general geological assessment of the Ottawa Street, Lawrence Lowland. The team was led by a geologist named Maurice Dupont, and the field notes from the survey, now held in the GSC archives in Ottawa, are detailed and methodical in the way that professional geological field notes of the period tend to be. At a specific location on the lower slopes of Cap Diamant, the team encountered a section of exposed limestone that Dupont describes as presenting unusual characteristics inconsistent with the expected behavior of the formation in that area. He notes that the rock surface in this section shows what he calls an atypical degree of smoothness and regularity, that certain features of the fracture pattern suggest modification by agencies other than natural weathering, and that there is an opening in the rock face at this point, roughly a meter in diameter, that he initially took to be a natural solution cavity, but that, on closer examination, appeared to have a degree of regularity in its geometry, suggesting it had been at least partly shaped by human action. He notes that the opening appeared to have been sealed at some point, with material that was no longer entirely intact, but that had clearly been placed deliberately, and that behind the partial seal there was darkness and an apparent void space that the team could not fully assess without entering. Dupont's recommendation, in the field notes, is that the feature be examined more thoroughly by someone with relevant archaeological expertise. His supervisor's response, added to the notes later, directs him to document the location for the record and proceed with the geological survey. No archaeological examination was arranged. The feature, if it still exists, is somewhere on the lower slopes of Cap Diamant, in an area that has been heavily built over in the intervening century and a half. Dupont's field notes are available in the GSC archives but are not widely cited, partly because geological survey notes from this period are not routinely searched by archaeologists, and partly because the specific implications of his description have not been fully recognized in the context of the broader pattern we have been discussing. The Dupont case is an example of what might be called parallel non-communication. Professional records from different disciplines that contain complementary information about the same phenomenon, but that exist in archival silos that researchers from different disciplines rarely cross. The GSC Geological Survey archives and the heritage archaeology literature rarely overlap, despite the obvious relevance of geological survey data to archaeological questions about subsurface features. The construction industry archives and the academic literature on Indigenous oral traditions rarely overlap, despite the direct relevance of each to the other in the context of underplaces research. The result is that evidence that would be compelling in combination remains isolated and underpowered in its separate archival locations. Part of what a systematic research project on the underplaces would accomplish, beyond the direct investigation of specific sites, is the integration of these parallel records. Bringing together the GSC Geological Survey notes, the Municipal Construction Archives, the Colonial Engineering Reports, the ethnographic oral tradition documentation, the Indigenous community knowledge, and the academic literature on pre-contact North American archaeology into a single interpretive framework is a project of considerable scope, but it is also a project that would produce a substantially clearer picture of what the evidence actually contains, both in terms of the existence and location of specific features, and in terms of what those features represent in the broader context of pre-contact history. Let us think about what happened at the specific historical moment when European settlement overlaid the pre-contact landscape of what became Canada's capital cities, because that moment of overlaying is where the story of the underplaces becomes most poignant and most complex. When John By's engineers began excavating the limestone of Bytown in the 1820s, they were not ignorant people. They were highly trained professional engineers applying the best knowledge of their time to a significant engineering challenge. But the knowledge they brought to the task did not include any framework for recognizing pre-contact construction in the North American landscape. The archaeological understanding of pre-contact North America was essentially non-existent in the 1820s. There was no discipline of North American archaeology. There was no systematic knowledge of what pre-contact peoples had built or where. There were indigenous peoples present in the landscape, and those peoples knew enormously more about the history of the landscape than any European settler, but the relationship between the settlers and the indigenous peoples was not one that would have made consultation a natural step. The engineering proceeded, and what was found was treated as an obstacle to be managed, not as a discovery to be investigated. That historical context does not excuse what happened, but it explains it. The engineers were not suppressing evidence they understood to be significant. They were encountering something they did not have the tools to understand, and dealing with it in the only way that made sense within their limited framework. The challenge for us now, having a much richer framework for understanding what might have been found, is to use that richer framework to recover as much of the record as possible without the luxury of having been there when the original encounters occurred. The encounters have continued, of course. They did not stop in the 1820s. They continued through the 19th century and into the 20th and into the 21st. Every generation of urban development in Canada's capital cities has produced its own encounters with anomalous subsurface features, and every generation has dealt with those encounters in much the same way, noting them, sometimes carefully and sometimes not, and then filling them in and moving on. The difference between the earliest encounters and the most recent is that the most recent have occurred in an institutional context, where the tools for recognizing their significance are available, where the oral tradition documentation is more extensive, where the archaeological framework for understanding pre-contact construction is more developed, and where the duty to consult obligations of Canadian heritage law create at least the possibility of a different response. But the institutional tools are not consistently applied. The duty to consult is not always triggered by anomalous subsurface findings in the context of municipal infrastructure work, particularly when those findings are ambiguous and when the project schedule creates pressure to deal with them quickly. The result is that even in the 21st century, encounters with potential underplaces in Canada's capital cities are in many cases being handled in the same way they were handled in the 19th century, documented in engineering notes and then filled in. This is a situation that can change, and there is some evidence that it is beginning to change. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the broader framework of reconciliation that has emerged in Canadian public discourse over the past decade have created a context in which the treatment of Indigenous cultural heritage, including the subsurface features described in Indigenous oral traditions, is receiving more careful attention than it has historically. Several municipalities have developed enhanced archaeological assessment protocols for construction work in areas with known or suspected pre-contact activity. Several provincial heritage agencies have strengthened the requirements for consultation with Indigenous communities before construction work in culturally significant areas. These changes are incremental and imperfect, but they represent a real shift in the institutional environment. More significant, in some ways, is the shift in the research environment. The growing recognition, in North American archaeology, of the importance of indigenous oral tradition as a form of evidence, and the growing willingness of researchers to engage with that tradition on its own terms, rather than as a supplement to material archaeology, is creating new possibilities for understanding the pre-contact landscape. Several research projects in Canada over the past decade have demonstrated the value of this approach for understanding specific landscape features, and the methodological precedents they have established can be applied to underplaces research. The question of who should lead this research is one that deserves careful thought. The conventional answer, in the tradition of archaeology, as it has been practiced in Canada for most of the 20th century, would be academic researchers working in collaboration with government heritage agencies. But that model has significant limitations in the context of underplaces research. The features themselves are located in the traditional territories of specific Indigenous communities, whose oral traditions hold the most direct and detailed knowledge of what those features are and where they are. The research, if it is to be both methodologically rigorous and respectful of those communities' rights and interests, needs to be led by, or at minimum, genuinely co-led by those communities, with academic and government expertise supporting the research agenda rather than defining it. This model of community-led research, with academic partnership, is already being practiced in a number of contexts in Canada and is increasingly being recognized as both ethically appropriate and scientifically superior for research on pre-contact landscapes. The underplaces offer an opportunity to extend this model to an area of investigation that is particularly important for the communities involved, and to demonstrate the value of the approach in a context that has high public significance because it involves the literal foundations of the country's capital cities. Let us spend some time now going back to the beginning of all this, back to the period before the features were built, before the cities were built, before any of the recorded history we have been examining. Let us go back to the time when the ice retreated and the land emerged from beneath the glaciers and the first people came north to inhabit it, because that beginning is the context in which the underplaces make most sense. The retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of what is now Canada under a mass of ice in some places more than 3 kilometers thick, was not a single event. It happened over several thousand years, from roughly 18,000 years ago to roughly 8,000 years ago, and during that long retreat, the landscape of what is now Canada was constantly changing. Rivers were forming and redirecting as the ice released them. Lakes were forming in glacially carved depressions and draining as ice dams collapsed. The land itself was rising, slowly and unevenly, as the enormous weight of the ice was removed from the rock below, a process called isostatic rebound that is still going on today, with parts of the shield still rising at measurable rates as they recover from the glacial load. Into this changing landscape came people. They came from the south, from regions that had been habitable during the glacial maximum, and they came along the coasts, following the retreating glaciers as they opened new territory. They came, in some cases, before the ice had fully retreated, penetrating into the subarctic and Arctic regions through coastal routes that were ice-free before the interior became habitable. And they came with the full range of human capabilities that their lineages had developed over tens of thousands of years of inhabiting every kind of environment. The ability to read landscape, to identify resources, to build shelter, to manage fire, to make tools, to transmit knowledge, and to organize collective effort for tasks that exceeded individual capacity. What they found, as they moved into the newly deglaciated landscape of what is now Canada, was a world of extraordinary resource abundance. The newly formed lakes and rivers teeming with fish, the newly established boreal forests full of large mammals that had not yet learned to fear human hunters, the coastal environments rich in marine resources, the plains, as the grasslands emerged in the interior, full of bison and other large herbivores. This was a landscape that rewarded engagement and skill, and the people who came into it brought both. The first communities to inhabit the landscape that would eventually contain Canada's capital cities were there for thousands of years before the features we have been discussing were built. If the oral tradition evidence is correct about those features being made by the old ones, people who came before the ancestors of the communities whose traditions describe them. During those early millennia, the communities were establishing the landscape knowledge, the ecological understanding, the social organization, and the cultural traditions that would eventually produce the construction activity implied by the underplaces. They were learning the river systems and the lake networks. They were learning the behavior of the animals and the seasonality of the plants. They were developing the technologies, including copper working, that would give them the capacity for large-scale construction. And they were developing the social forms, the networks of kinship and trade and ceremony, that would allow that capacity to be organized into collective action. This is a long process, and it happened across an enormous geographic range. The landscape of what became Canada's capital cities is spread across nearly the entire breadth of the continent, from St. John's on the Atlantic to Victoria on the Pacific. The communities that inhabited these different locations were different from each other in many ways. Different languages, different ecological adaptations, different ceremonial traditions, but they were connected through the long-distance exchange networks that moved copper and other materials across thousands of miles, through the travel routes along the river systems, through the occasional convergence of communities at significant locations for trade and ceremony, and through those connections, traditions could be shared. The hypothesis that the underplaces represent a shared tradition of subsurface construction, transmitted across this network over hundreds or thousands of years, is one that the oral tradition evidence consistently suggests, even if the material evidence to confirm it directly is not available. The consistency of the tradition across culturally distinct communities is its strongest feature. When Mi'kmaq elders in Nova Scotia and Anishinaabe elders in Ontario and Cree elders in Manitoba and Lakapamuks elders in British Columbia all describe the subsurface features of their traditional territories using conceptually similar language, referring to features that were made by earlier people, that served combined practical and ceremonial purposes, and that were deliberately sealed. The probability that this consistency reflects a genuine shared tradition is substantially higher than the probability that it reflects coincidence. The human mind is remarkably consistent across cultures in certain kinds of activity. The impulse to mark significant locations, to create permanent features in the landscape that encode important knowledge, to use underground spaces for ceremony and storage. These are impulses that appear in human cultures across the entire globe throughout the entire span of human history. What distinguishes the tradition implied by the underplaces evidence from these general impulses is the specific combination of features: large-scale construction, multifunctional use, deliberate sealing, and the concept of the underplaces as repositories of location-specific knowledge. This specific combination, appearing consistently across the broad geography of pre-contact Canada, suggests something more than a general human impulse. It suggests a specific tradition, developed in specific cultural contexts and transmitted through the networks that connected those contexts. Understanding that tradition in sufficient detail to interpret what was built and why is the ultimate goal of underplaces research. It is a goal that cannot be reached from the archival record alone, or from the oral tradition accounts alone, or from any single source. It requires the kind of multi-source, interdisciplinary, community-engaged investigation that we have been describing throughout this story, and it requires the kind of sustained attention over a long period of time that institutional research too rarely provides. But the goal is worth pursuing, not just for the knowledge it would produce, but for what the pursuit itself represents. Investigating the underplaces seriously, with the rigor and the respect that the evidence deserves, is an act of recognizing that the history of this land does not begin with European settlement, that the ground beneath Canada's capital cities holds layers of human activity going back thousands of years, and that those layers deserve to be known and understood. It is an act of taking seriously the people who built the underplaces, whoever they were, as intelligent and capable human beings, whose construction choices reflected sophisticated knowledge and complex purposes. And it is an act of taking seriously the communities whose oral traditions have preserved knowledge of those construction choices across the millennia as holders of evidence that has value for understanding the past and for understanding the present. These are acts of recognition that matter beyond the specific question of what is beneath the streets of Ottawa or Quebec City or Halifax. They are part of a larger recognition that is slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely developing in Canadian public life. The recognition that this land has a history much deeper than the history of European settlement, and that deeper history is not just the background against which Canadian history happened, but an integral part of what Canada is and what it can become. The underplaces are beneath the capital cities. They are beneath the streets and the parliaments and the museums and the monuments. They are beneath the places where the official history of Canada is embodied and celebrated and contested and refined. And their presence there, their patient persistence through everything that has happened above them, is a reminder that the official history is not the whole history, and that the whole history is richer and stranger and more interesting than the official history has so far found room to acknowledge. That richer, stranger, more interesting history is what we have been tracing through this story. Not to replace the official history, but to add depth to it, to reveal the layers beneath the surface account, to suggest that the ground on which Canada's institutions stand is more storied than the institutions have recognized. The underplaces are not a threat to the history of Canada. They are a dimension of it, a dimension that has been missing from the account, and whose inclusion would make that account not just more accurate, but more worthy of the land it describes. We have travelled a long way in this story, from the limestone beneath Ottawa, to the sandstone of Charlottetown, to the ancient rock of St. A. John's, to the plains of Regina and the river valley of Edmonton and the harbour peninsula of Victoria. We have moved through engineering reports and geological field notes and ethnographic accounts and oral tradition evidence and academic papers, through the records of engineers and construction foremen and city planners and retired geologists and ethnographers and community elders, all of them in their different ways, encountering or describing or preserving knowledge of the same thing, the features made by human hands beneath the places that became Canada's capital cities. The story is not finished. It will not be finished until the investigation is done, and the investigation is just beginning. But the pattern is clear enough to say with confidence that there is something here worth understanding, something that the evidence, in all its fragmentary and incidental and oral tradition form, consistently points toward, something that was built by people who knew what they were doing, who went into the earth deliberately and made things there with skill and purpose and the intention of permanence. Something that has been waiting beneath the streets of the capitals for the serious attention that the evidence has warranted for a very long time. And perhaps, in the listening, in the willingness to follow the trail of fragmentary evidence through archival collections and oral traditions and geological surveys and construction records, in the willingness to take seriously the possibility that the ground beneath Canada's capital cities has a history that the official history has not yet incorporated. Perhaps that is the beginning of the kind of attention these features deserve. Not excavation, not yet, maybe not ever, in the form of the dramatic dig that would make for a more satisfying narrative, but attention, recognition, the willingness to look at the pattern the evidence makes and to say, this is real, this matters, and it deserves to be understood. The underplaces are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time, and the people who built them, the old ones whose names and languages and specific cultural traditions are in many cases no longer known, built them well enough that they have waited through everything that the thousands of years since their construction have brought to the land above them. That patience, that endurance, that quality of having been made to last, is itself a form of communication. It says something about what the builders believed the features contained, about how important they considered that content to be, about the confidence they had in the capacity of what they made to outlast the immediate moment and to reach across time to whoever came later with the capacity to recognize it. We are, perhaps, the ones who came later. We have the evidence, however fragmentary. We have the oral traditions, however imperfectly documented. We have the geological knowledge to understand the substrates. We have the archaeological frameworks, however still incomplete, to contextualize the findings. We have the non-invasive survey technologies to look without disrupting. And we have, in the ongoing development of reconciliation in Canada, a political and ethical context in which the recognition of pre-contact heritage as part of the full history of the country is more possible than it has ever been. All that is needed is the willingness to actually do the work, to take the fragments of evidence seriously enough to pursue them, to treat the oral traditions as evidence worth incorporating into the research design, to develop the institutional protocols that prevent underplaces from being filled in before they can be examined, to fund the collaborative research that the investigation requires, to be patient with the slow, undramatic, methodical accumulation of evidence that is the only way this investigation can actually proceed. The work is worth doing, the history it would recover is worth knowing, and the ground beneath the capitals, patient and persistent, has been holding its secrets long enough. Let us come back to the surface now. Let us come back to the ordinary world of the streets and the rivers and the harbour lights and the parliament buildings and the monuments and the museums. Let us come back to the present, where we began, with the night and the dark and the question of what is beneath the places we know. What you carry away from this story, if you carry anything, might simply be this. The ground beneath you has a history. Every city in the world sits on accumulated layers of human activity, and the layers that matter most are not always the ones that made it into the textbooks. Sometimes the most important layers are the ones that were never quite visible enough, or that were too inconvenient to acknowledge, or that were encountered at the wrong moment, in the wrong context, by people who did not have the tools to understand what they were looking at. Those layers are still there. The evidence of them, however fragmentary, is still in the archives, in the oral traditions, in the geological surveys, in the construction notes. And the pattern they make, when you look at all of them together, is a pattern that points at something real. The underplaces of Canada's capital cities are that something real. They are the physical record of a human engagement with the landscape of northern North America that goes back thousands of years beyond what the conventional history of those capitals begins. They are the built expression of a relationship between people and the earth that was sophisticated, intentional, multi-purpose, and lasting. And they are, despite everything that has happened above them, still there. This is your last soft moment with this story, before sleep takes it and makes it part of whatever it becomes, in the particular way your mind processes things in the night. You have been listening to this for a long time, following the thread from the limestone of Ottawa to the red sandstone of Charlottetown, through the archives and the oral traditions and the geological surveys and the construction records, and the thread has led you somewhere specific, to the recognition that the ground beneath Canada's capital cities holds a history that has not been fully told, that the evidence for it is real and scattered and waiting for someone to take it seriously, and that the people who built the underplaces knew what they were doing and built well enough that what they made has lasted. That patience, that building well enough to last, is a kind of message. Not a dramatic one, not a message in the sense of a decoded inscription or a sealed letter with readable words, but a message in the more fundamental sense of a fact about intention and craft and the belief that the future would matter, that whoever came later would be worth building for. The old ones built things that have lasted through everything. Whatever they knew, whatever they kept, they considered it worth the effort of making it last. What they knew, and what they kept, is still there. Waiting, as things built to last tend to wait, for the conditions that will allow them to be found and understood. Those conditions are developing. The investigation is possible, the evidence is real, and the story, as it always has been, is in the ground beneath our feet, patient and persistent, and worth the effort of understanding. If this has been the kind of story that slows your breathing and loosens the grip of the day, then it has done what it was made to do. These long, slow explorations of the things that happened before the official history began are made for exactly the quality of attention you bring to them in the dark. When the day is done and the mind is ready to move through a different kind of time, the deep time of a continent's worth of human history, laid down in the rock and the clay and the limestone beneath the places we have built our present on. The river runs beneath the bridge lights, the harbour catches the late glow, the plains run out to every horizon, and beneath all of it, in the dark and the quiet and the stone, the underplaces wait. They have always waited. They will go on waiting, with the particular patience of things made to last, until the serious attention they deserve finally comes. And when it does, what they tell us about who was here before, and what they knew and what they made and what they kept will be worth everything that the waiting cost. You do not need to do anything with this tonight. You do not need to remember every detail or hold every thread of evidence. You only need to carry the shape of it, that the history goes deeper than the textbooks say, that the people who were here before built things that lasted, that the ground beneath the capitals of Canada holds more than the foundations of the buildings above. That is enough for one night. The rest can wait. The rest, after all, has been waiting a very long time already. A little longer will not matter. And when the morning comes, and the ordinary world reasserts itself with all its ordinary demands, the knowledge that the ground has depth, that history has layers, that the underplaces are there beneath the streets, will still be true. It will still be waiting, like all the things built to last, for the moment when it becomes possible to finally understand it properly. That moment is coming. The work is beginning. And this is where the story rests, not ends, rests. Because a story about things still underground and still waiting cannot really end, only pause for the night, while the listening continues in the particular way that sleeping minds continue to process what waking minds have received. Rest now. The underplaces will be there in the morning. They have been there for a very long time. They are not going anywhere, and neither, in whatever form matters most, is the knowledge that they exist. Let us go to one more place before the night fully settles in, because there is a thread we have not yet pulled on that connects the underplaces to something very specific about the timing of the cities built above them, and that specificity is one of the most interesting and least discussed dimensions of the story. The selection of capital city sites in Canada was, in almost every case, a practical decision made by colonial administrators and European settlers on the basis of criteria that made sense to them: defensibility, access to water, position on trade routes, distance from rival powers. The governors and colonial officials who designated these sites were not thinking about pre-contact landscape significance. They were thinking about harbours, rivers, and supply lines. And yet, in case after case, the sites they chose were sites that the indigenous peoples of the region had already identified as significant locations, often in ways that the colonial records note without understanding. The confluence of rivers is the most common feature. Ottawa sits at the confluence of the Ottawa and Rideau rivers. Winnipeg sits at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine. Fredericton sits at a major bend of the St. John River that creates a natural concentration of fish and game. Quebec City sits on the promontory that commands the narrowing of the St. John. Lawrence, a strategic control point for river travel. Halifax sits in a harbour that the Mi'kmaq considered one of the most significant locations on the Atlantic coast. Victoria sits at the edge of a strait that has been the primary passage between the mainland and the island for as long as people have been travelling in the region. Regina sits near the creek system that was the primary water source for the Central Plains. Edmonton sits at a river crossing that was a major node in the interior trail network. Charlottetown sits in a harbour that is protected by geography in ways that made it the natural gathering point for the island's communities. Street. Johns sits in a harbour so deep and so well protected that it is almost uniquely suited for use as a port. In every case, the colonial designation of these sites as capital cities was following, without knowing it, a logic that indigenous peoples had already applied. The best locations for human settlement on a landscape, the confluences and the promontories, and the protected harbours, are the best locations for any community, regardless of when it arrives. Colonial settlers chose the same sites that earlier peoples had already chosen, for many of the same practical reasons, plus the additional dimension of strategic defensibility that the colonial context added. The difference is the historical depth. The colonial settlement of these sites represents 150 to 200 years of occupation, while the indigenous recognition of their significance represents thousands of years. This temporal depth matters for the underplaces story, because it means that the underplaces, if they were built at the most significant locations in the pre-contact landscape, were built at exactly the sites where the capital cities now stand. The correspondence is not coincidental. It is the result of the same geographic logic operating across different time periods and different cultures. The best places to build significant features, whether above or below the ground, are the same places that later become significant enough to be designated as capitals. This convergence is itself a kind of evidence. If the underplaces were randomly distributed across the landscape, you would not expect them to cluster at the specific sites that later became capital cities. But if the underplaces are concentrated at the most significant locations in the pre-contact landscape, and if capital cities were established at the most significant locations in the European colonial geography, And if those two sets of most significant locations overlap substantially because they are responding to the same underlying geographic logic, then you would expect to find the underplaces precisely beneath the capital cities, which is what the evidence suggests you do find. This is not a guarantee that the underplaces are present at every capital. The evidence is not complete enough to make that claim, but it is a structural argument for why capital cities are the most likely places to find underplaces evidence, and it gives the overall pattern a coherence that the individual cases, taken in isolation, might not seem to have. The capitals are not random samples of the Canadian landscape. They are the most significant nodes in the colonial geographic logic, and they correspond, structurally, to the most significant nodes in the pre-contact geographic logic. The underplaces, as features of the pre-contact landscape, are thus more likely to be found at the capitals than at any other set of locations of comparable geographic size. This structural argument also has implications for the investigation. It suggests that a systematic survey of capital city sites, using all the available evidence sources, is not just a reasonable starting point for underplaces research, but potentially the most efficient possible research strategy, because the probability of finding significant features is higher at these sites than at most other locations. The capitals concentrate the evidence in the same way that confluences concentrate travelers, because both are responding to the same underlying geographic logic. Let us think about what the investigation of the underplaces at specific capital city sites would actually involve at the level of practical fieldwork, because it is important to have a concrete picture of what the research would look like and what it would require. At a site like Ottawa, the starting point would be the integration of all available source material. The Hargreaves letter from 1827, the 1901 water main report, the Anishinaabe oral tradition accounts for the Chaudière area, the DuPont GSC survey notes, and any other incidental documentation that a systematic archival search would reveal. These sources, analyzed together, would provide a set of candidate locations where subsurface features are most likely to be present, located at the intersections between oral tradition accounts of specific underplace locations and documentary accounts of anomalous subsurface findings. These candidate locations would then be assessed for accessibility. Which of them are in areas where non-invasive survey could be conducted without disrupting critical infrastructure, where surface conditions permit effective GPR or similar survey, and where the depth of the potentially significant features is within the range of available survey methods. In practice, many of the candidate locations would not be accessible by non-invasive methods because they are buried under buildings or under infrastructure that prevents effective survey, but some would be in parks, in areas with lower building coverage, or in locations where utility access permits limited survey opportunities. A systematic assessment of each candidate location, in terms of its survey accessibility, would identify the subset of candidates where non-invasive survey is feasible and would provide the data needed to prioritize the survey effort. The survey itself would require standard GPR equipment and trained operators, plus potentially other non-invasive methods like magnetometry or seismic survey, depending on the specific geology of each location. At sites where the substrate is limestone, as in Ottawa and Quebec City, GPR effectiveness is generally good because limestone provides good contrast with void spaces or worked stone features. At sites where the substrate is glacial till or clay, as in parts of the Winnipeg and Regina areas, GPR effectiveness is lower and additional methods may be needed. At sites where the bedrock is close to the surface, and the features are likely to be in the rock itself, as in the Halifax and Street John's cases, GPR effectiveness depends on the specific character of the rock and the depth of the features. The results of the non-invasive survey would be interpreted in the context of the oral tradition and archival evidence, and any anomalies identified by the survey that correspond to candidate locations from those sources would be prioritized for more detailed assessment. More detailed assessment might involve targeted hand excavation in accessible areas, or in some cases the use of small diameter boring equipment to obtain core samples from specific depths without the disruption of full excavation. The goal at this stage would not be to expose or recover the features, but to confirm their presence and characterize their general nature sufficiently to support decisions about further investigation. Further investigation, if warranted, would need to be conducted in close partnership with the relevant Indigenous communities, with full transparency about what was found and what is proposed, and with community consent for any intrusive work. This is not just an ethical requirement, though it is that. It is a methodological requirement because the oral tradition knowledge held by the communities is essential for interpreting any features that are found, and that knowledge is only accessible through genuine partnership, not through the extraction of information from reluctant or skeptical community members. The partnership model for this kind of research has been successfully demonstrated in several contexts in Canada and elsewhere. The key features of successful partnerships are shared decision-making authority over the research agenda, genuine community benefit from the research outcomes, appropriate handling of sensitive knowledge, including the option for communities to withhold information that they consider too sensitive to share in a public research context, and long-term relationships that persist beyond any individual research project. Building these relationships takes time, and it requires investment in community engagement well before any fieldwork begins. The timeline for a research program of this scope, conducted responsibly and in genuine partnership, would be measured in years rather than months. Initial archival research and oral tradition documentation could begin relatively quickly. The development of partnerships with the relevant Indigenous communities would take longer, requiring the establishment of trust and the negotiation of research agreements that meet community standards. The non-invasive survey would follow once the candidate locations had been identified and the partnership frameworks were in place. The interpretation of survey results and the development of proposals for further investigation would require additional time for consultation and deliberation. A realistic timeline for reaching the point of having a clear picture of what is beneath 2 or 3 capital city sites in sufficient detail to support informed decisions about further investigation would be 5 to 10 years. This is not a dramatic timeline. It is the timeline of serious, responsible research, conducted with the respect for the evidence and for the communities involved that the research demands. The alternative, a fast-tracked investigation that cuts corners on community engagement and archival thoroughness in pursuit of dramatic results, would produce inferior science and damaged relationships that would impede investigation for years afterward. The patient approach is the right approach, both ethically and methodologically. Let us think about what the discovery of intact, well-preserved underplaces at one or more capital city sites would mean for Canadian history and for the broader understanding of pre-contact North America. Not the fantasy discovery of a spectacular underground complex full of artifacts that immediately answers every question, but the realistic discovery of what the evidence suggests. Passages, or chambers, in the substrate of the relevant geology, with evidence of deliberate construction, and potentially with evidence of the purposes for which they were made. The immediate significance would be the confirmation of the pattern that the archival and oral tradition evidence suggests, that organized, deliberate subsurface construction was part of the pre-contact history of the sites that became Canada's capital cities. This confirmation would require a revision of the conventional archaeological timeline for the regions involved, acknowledging that the populations living in these areas at the relevant times were engaged in construction activity of a kind and scale that the conventional timeline has not accounted for. It would strengthen the broader revision of the Clovis First model and the underestimation of pre-contact North American organizational sophistication that has been underway in academic archaeology for the past 2 decades. And it would provide the kind of concrete, material evidence that has been missing from the underplaces discussion, evidence that could move the conversation from the accumulation of fragmentary and incidental documentation to the direct investigation of specific, confirmed features. The longer-term significance would depend on what the features contained, what they could tell us about the purposes for which they were built, and how they could be interpreted in the context of the oral tradition knowledge that has been preserved about them. If the interpretation of the features as repositories of location-specific knowledge is even approximately correct, the investigation of intact features might yield not just physical objects, but structural evidence of the knowledge transmission function, evidence of how the spaces were designed to produce specific kinds of experiences or to encode specific kinds of information in their spatial organization. This kind of structural evidence is genuinely rare in pre-contact North American archaeology, and its significance for understanding the epistemological traditions of the cultures involved would be substantial. At a cultural and political level, the discovery and serious investigation of underplaces beneath Canada's capital cities would be a powerful statement about the depth of the history of those places. Capital cities are not just administrative centres, they are symbolic centres, places where a society expresses its understanding of its own history and its own identity. The acknowledgement that the ground beneath these symbolic centres was shaped by human hands thousands of years before the cities were built would be an acknowledgement of the depth and complexity of the pre-European history of the Prom land, an acknowledgement that would resonate far beyond the academic community and that would contribute to the ongoing work of reconciliation in ways that no policy document or public statement could fully replicate. History that lives in the ground is a different kind of history from history that lives in documents or monuments. It is harder to dispute, harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. When a geologist or an archaeologist can stand in a specific place and say, "This was made by human hands, at this depth, with these techniques, for these purposes, and it has been here for this long," that statement has a weight that purely archival or oral tradition evidence cannot quite achieve. The material reality of the underplaces, their presence in the rock and clay beneath the streets of the capitals, is the kind of evidence that changes conversations. The conversations that need to change are not obscure academic debates. They are the conversations at the centre of Canadian public life about what this country is, what its history means, and what responsibilities flow from that history. The underplaces are part of the answer to those questions. A material answer, an answer in stone and clay and the deliberate shaping of the ground. And the investigation of the underplaces is part of the work of becoming a country that takes its full history seriously enough to look for it, even when looking requires going underground. This is a story about what is beneath the surface, not metaphorically, but literally, materially, measurably, beneath the surface of the cities where some of the most important conversations about Canadian history and identity are happening. The underplaces are part of those conversations. They have always been part of those conversations, even when the conversations did not know they existed. The work of bringing them into the light, carefully and responsibly, and in partnership with the communities whose heritage they represent, is the work of a generation, and it is work that this country is, for the first time, in a position to undertake seriously. The Ottawa River runs. The Street Lawrence narrows at the promontory above Quebec City. The harbour at Halifax holds its winter light. The Wollastock bends past the capital of New Brunswick. The Strait of Juan de Fuca opens beyond the harbour at Victoria. The Red and Assiniboine meet at the Forks in Winnipeg. The plains extend past Regina in every direction. The North Saskatchewan cuts through the valley at Edmonton. The Charlottetown harbour fills with the tide from the Gulf. The harbour at Street Johns holds the deep cold of the Atlantic, and beneath all of them, under all the rivers, and the harbours, and the plains, and the rock, something waits. It has been waiting long enough. It is time to go looking. There is one final thing to say about the underplaces, and it is not a thing about evidence, or methodology, or institutional dynamics, or the revision of historical timelines. It is a thing about what it means to live in a place. Most of us, most of the time, experience the places we live in as a surface. We experience the streets and the buildings and the parks and the rivers as they present themselves to us from the outside, from the ground level, from the human scale of movement through an inhabited landscape. We do not habitually think about what is beneath the surface, what the ground underfoot holds, what the deep layers of the landscape contain. This is not a criticism. It is simply the nature of how humans typically experience their environments. But there are moments when the surface cracks, or when someone says something that makes you aware of the depth beneath it, and in those moments the quality of your experience of the place changes. You become aware, however briefly, that the ground you walk on is not the beginning of the world but the most recent layer of a long accumulation, that beneath the surface there are depths containing other surfaces, containing still further depths, going down through the history of the place all the way to the rock that the glaciers left when they retreated and the world began to green again. This story has been, among other things, an attempt to create one of those moments of depth awareness, to take the familiar surfaces of Canada's capital cities, the streets and the Parliament buildings and the harbour fronts and the river walkways, and to suggest that they have depths that are older and stranger and more layered with human meaning than the surfaces suggest. The underplaces are real, or as real as the evidence that points toward them, and what they suggest about the depth of this land's human history is more interesting and more humbling than the official histories of the capitals have typically acknowledged. The depth is there whether you know about it or not. The underplaces are there whether they have been investigated or not. The oral traditions that describe them are as true as oral traditions are, which is to say, as true as any form of evidence that has been transmitted with care across many generations by people who considered the transmission their responsibility. And the archival record, fragmentary and incidental as it is as real as the paper it is printed on and the professional hands that wrote it. You have been listening to a story about depth, about what lies under the surface of familiar places, about what was built in the ground of this continent by people who lived here thousands of years before the cities were built above their work, about what the evidence, in all its imperfect and scattered forms, suggests about the pre-contact history of the land that Canada was built on, about what that suggestion means for how we understand that history and how we might, going forward, take it more seriously. The night is getting quieter around you. The day that was is being replaced by the night that is. And in the quiet, if you hold the shape of this story gently, rather than gripping it hard enough to squeeze out the complexity, what you might find remaining is simply this. The ground beneath the capitals has a history. The history is real, and taking it seriously is the work of a country that wants to know itself. That is enough. That is, in the deepest sense of the phrase, enough for tonight. The Ottawa River keeps its secrets in the limestone beneath the city, named for the Kichi Sibi. The Chaudiere Falls have been a place of power for thousands of years, and will be for thousands more. The Algonquin oral tradition knows the underplaces are there. The engineering records from 1827 know the underplaces are there. And somewhere in the dark beneath the Parliament buildings and the museums and the bridges and the locks of the Rideau Canal, in the fitted limestone passages that Lieutenant Hargreaves could not bring himself to go far into, whatever was placed there by the old ones, who went into the earth and made something worth making, whatever was sealed there when the time for sealing came, is still there, patient as stone, waiting as long as it takes, certain, in the way that things built to last are certain, that eventually the ones who need to find it will. Maybe that is us. Maybe we are the eventually. Maybe the moment when the underplaces of Canada's capital cities receive the serious investigation they deserve is closer than it seems, given how long the waiting has already been. Maybe the conversations happening now in the corridors of Canadian universities and heritage agencies and Indigenous community organizations, the conversations about reconciliation and pre-contact history and the revision of the archaeological timeline and the integration of Indigenous knowledge with scientific research, maybe those conversations are the beginning of the eventually. Maybe this story is part of them. It is late, and the night is doing what nights do. And the underplaces are doing what they have always done, which is nothing and everything, which is simply existing, in the dark, beneath the surface, filled with whatever they were filled with by whoever filled them, waiting with the particular patience of things made to outlast the ordinary span of human attention. They have outlasted a great deal. They can outlast a little longer. And when the investigation finally comes, when the patient collaboration between researchers and communities and institutions finally produces the conditions for a serious look at what the evidence has been pointing toward for 150 years, the underplaces will be there. They will still be there. They are patient, and they have waited long enough for us to at least begin to take them seriously. Sleep well, dream of depth. The ground beneath your feet has layers you have not yet imagined. There is a dimension of this investigation that we have not yet fully explored, and it concerns the relationship between the underplaces and the natural world above them in ways that go beyond the simple physical relationship of construction to substrate. The oral tradition accounts of multiple communities describe the underplaces not just as built features, but as features that were built in relationship to specific natural processes. The movement of underground water, the behavior of specific rock formations in specific seasons, the way certain locations behave differently at different times of year in ways that the builders recognized and incorporated into the design of the features. The movement of underground water is particularly consistent across multiple accounts. The Wolastoqiyik traditions for the St. John River Valley described the passages and chambers in the riverbanks as features that were positioned in relationship to the movement of water through the rock, features that used the natural hydrology of the limestone formations to serve specific functions. Some of the features described are essentially elaborate versions of natural springs, channels that were shaped to control the emergence of water at specific points and in specific volumes. Others are described as places where the relationship between underground water and surface water was made visible, where you could enter the ground and observe the processes that produced the surface features that the community depended on for water and for fish. The Cree traditions for the Winnipeg confluence area describe the subsurface features near the confluence in terms of their relationship to the confluence itself, to the way the two rivers met at depth as well as at the surface. The concept of the rivers meeting underground as well as above ground, of the confluence extending into the substrate in ways that were recognized and worked with by the builders of the underplaces. This is an interesting one that connects the features to the natural geography of the site in a way that makes their placement at the confluence even more logical than simple practical convenience would explain. The features were built where the rivers met underground as well as above, and the design of the features incorporated the underground meeting of the waters as a feature rather than treating it as simply a complication to be managed. The Anishinaabe traditions for the Ottawa Valley area describe the relationship between the underplaces and the Chaudière Falls in terms that suggest the features were designed to use the energy of the falls in some way, though the specific nature of that use is not clear from the available documentation. The concept of using the energy of falling water, whether for mechanical purposes or for ceremonial ones, is one that appears in pre-contact traditions from various parts of the world, and the specific location of the Chaudière Falls as a major source of energy in the pre-contact landscape of the Ottawa Valley makes it logical that any significant construction in the area would have incorporated a relationship to that energy source. These descriptions of the underplaces as features that were built in active relationship with natural processes, rather than simply as features built into natural substrates, suggest a level of environmental understanding and engineering sophistication that goes beyond what the conventional archaeological timeline attributes to the relevant populations. To build a feature that uses the movement of underground water for a specific purpose requires knowing how that water moves, where it comes from, where it goes, how it behaves in different seasons, and how its behavior can be modified without disrupting the processes that make it useful. This is hydrological knowledge of a kind that requires systematic observation over long periods of time and the transmission of that observation through reliable mechanisms. It is not the kind of knowledge that a small nomadic band acquires and retains. It is the kind of knowledge that an organized community with long-term commitment to a specific place develops over generations and transmits through formal mechanisms. The existence of this kind of knowledge, encoded in the oral tradition accounts of the underplaces and implied by the design of the features those accounts describe, is one of the most significant implications of the underplaces evidence. It implies not just the capacity for organized construction, but the development, over an extended period, of a sophisticated knowledge tradition relating to specific landscape features. It implies communities with long-term territorial commitments, with the stability and the social organization to maintain knowledge systems over generations, and with the understanding that the specific knowledge required for the design and maintenance of subsurface features is knowledge worth preserving with great care. This is a picture of pre-contact communities in Canada that is substantially different from the conventional picture of small, mobile, subsistence-oriented bands. It is a picture of communities with deep place-based knowledge, with sophisticated environmental understanding, and with the organizational capacity to build and maintain features that serve complex, multi-purpose functions over long periods of time. It is, in short, a picture that the recent revision of the conventional archaeological timeline for North America supports, and that the underplaces evidence, taken seriously, requires. The oral tradition accounts of the underplaces are not just evidence of the existence of specific features, they are evidence of the existence of the knowledge tradition that produced those features and that has, in fragmented form, preserved information about them across the millennia since they were built. Taking those accounts seriously as evidence means taking seriously the picture of pre-contact communities that they imply. Communities with depth of knowledge, sophistication of organization, and long-term commitment to specific places that the conventional picture has systematically underestimated. And this, perhaps, is the most important implication of the Underplaces story for the broader question of how we understand pre-contact North America. Not just that significant construction happened in unexpected places at unexpected times, but that the communities that conducted that construction were more like what the oral traditions described them as being: knowledgeable, organized, sophisticated, deeply connected to specific landscapes than like what the conventional archaeological timeline has allowed for. The Underplaces are material evidence of a way of being human in this landscape that deserves to be recognized in its full complexity and depth. There is something else to say before this story truly rests, something that belongs at the end of a long night of listening, when the mind has been moving through deep time and the body is heavy with the kind of tiredness that comes from following a long, complex thread. The Underplaces story is not finished, and it will not be finished for a very long time, possibly not in the lifetime of anyone listening to this. The investigation that the evidence warrants has not been done. The collaborative research that the communities involved deserve has not been funded. The archival work that would integrate the fragmentary records into a coherent picture has not been completed. The non-invasive surveys that would identify accessible candidate locations have not been conducted. The protocols that would prevent further loss of evidence during urban construction have not been widely implemented. The conversations between researchers and communities that would build the trust necessary for genuine partnership in investigation have, in many places, barely begun. All of this is true, and it matters to acknowledge, because the temptation at the end of a story like this is to leave you with the feeling that the situation is being handled, that someone responsible is taking care of it, that the evidence is in good hands. It is not in that kind of hands. It is in the hands of a diffuse and inconsistent set of researchers and community members and archivists and heritage managers, many of them doing important work, but none of them with the mandate or the resources to do it at the scale and the systematic comprehensiveness that the evidence demands. What would change that? What would move the Underplaces investigation from the margins, where it has existed for 150 years, to the center of the research agenda? The answer is probably a combination of things: a significant discovery that breaks through into public consciousness, sustained pressure from Indigenous communities for recognition of their heritage in the specific forms that the Underplaces represent, and the development of collaborative research models that are beginning to be established in Canadian archaeology into something robust and well-funded enough to take on a project of this scope. Any of these things could happen. The first is the most unpredictable. You cannot plan for the accidental discovery that changes everything, though you can create the conditions that make such discoveries more likely to be recognized and preserved when they occur, rather than filled in and forgotten. The second is already underway, as Indigenous communities throughout Canada increasingly assert their rights to their heritage and their authority over research conducted in their traditional territories. The third is developing, more slowly than it should, but developing. In the meantime, the Underplaces wait. And we, who have spent this long night listening to the evidence that points toward them, carry with us now a kind of awareness that changes how we walk through the capital cities, how we think about the streets and the rivers and the foundations and the substrates. We know as well as the evidence allows us to know, that the ground beneath those cities has a history that the streets do not show. We know that the history goes deeper than the records in the archives. We know that the people who built the Underplaces knew what they were doing and did it well enough that what they made has lasted. And we know that the story of what they made and what it means is waiting to be told in full. The full telling will come, not tonight, not soon, but eventually, in the patient way that all things built to last eventually find the attention they were built to receive. The Underplaces have been waiting for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer, and you have been listening for a long time. The night is deep, and the world is quiet, and the sleep that has been waiting at the edge of your attention is ready to come in now. Let it. The story will all be here when you wake. The Underplaces will be where they have always been, beneath the streets of the capitals, patient and real. And the morning, when it comes, will be the same morning that has always come, casting light on the surfaces of things, while the depths wait their turn. Sleep now. The depth is always right there, as it has always been. That is enough.